The courtroom smelled like polished wood and cheap cologne, a mix that made my stomach churn as I stepped inside. I adjusted my tie, borrowed from a coworker because I didn't own one, and scanned the room. There she was, 2 rows ahead, her dark hair pulled into a sleek bun, that familiar smirk playing on her lips. My wife sat next to a lawyer who looked like he charged by the syllable, his suit sharper than the betrayal I'd been carrying for months. Her mother was there too, perched like a vulture in her pearl necklace, whispering just loud enough for me to catch it. They'll try to gild her again. Watch. I wanted to shout, to tell them all how wrong they were, but I kept my mouth shut. My hands gripped the folder in my lap, the edges worn from nights spent staring at it, wondering if I had the guts to use what was inside. 10 years. That's how long I'd poured everything into her dream, her wellness studios that now dotted the city like glittering trophies. I'd worked 3 jobs to make it happen, hauling concrete at construction sites, running delivery routes until midnight, and designing logos on a cracked laptop until my eyes burned. All so she could have her empire. And now? Now she sat there, laughing with the crowd as she called me a leech. He doesn't even have a real job, she said, her voice light, like she was tossing out a joke at a dinner party. The room chuckled, and I felt the heat crawl up my neck. I wasn't here to play the victim, though. I wasn't here to beg. I'd spent a decade building something with her, believing we were a team, but the second her studios started pulling in millions, I became invisible. Worse than invisible, a liability. She'd rewritten our story, turned me into some deadbeat who just tagged along for the ride. The judge banged his gavel, and the room quieted. My lawyer, a guy I could barely afford, leaned over and muttered, "You ready?" I nodded, but my eyes stayed on her. She didn't even glance my way, too busy whispering to her attorney, probably planning how to spin this to her followers online. Wellness guru fights off greedy ex would make a great headline, wouldn't it? But I wasn't greedy. I wasn't even angry, not anymore. I was tired. Tired of being erased. Tired of pretending I hadn't given up everything for her. The folder in my hands felt heavier than it should have, like it carried the weight of all those years. Inside was one sheet of paper, one signature, one promise she'd forgotten, but I never would. I'd found it in a storage box a month ago, buried under old tax returns and sketches I'd drawn for her first studio's logo. Back when we were just 2 kids in love, dreaming big over instant noodles. The judge called my name, and my throat tightened. This was it. I stood, my legs steady despite the nerves buzzing through me. The room watched, waiting for me to fumble, to prove her right. But I wasn't leaving this courtroom empty-handed. Not today. I handed the folder to my lawyer, who gave me a small nod, like he knew what this moment meant. As he walked toward the judge's bench, I caught her mother's eye. She looked smug, certain I was about to embarrass myself. Let her think that. Let them all think that. I sat back down, my heart pounding but my mind clear. The paper in that folder wasn't just a contract, it was proof. Proof of what I'd given, what I'd built, what I deserved. The lawyer handed it to the judge, and I watched her face for the first time since I'd walked in. Her smirk faltered, just for a second, like she sensed something was coming. She didn't know what yet, but she would. Soon. Everyone in this room would. I leaned back in my chair, the noise of the courtroom fading into a dull hum. For the first time in years, I felt like I was in control. Not of her, not of the studios, but of my own story. And today, I was going to start telling it. 10 years ago, our life was small but full, squeezed into a 1-bedroom apartment in Queens that smelled faintly of mildew and takeout. I can still picture it. The sagging couch we'd scored off the curb, the tiny kitchen table where we'd sit with mugs of instant coffee, dreaming up a future that felt just out of reach. My hands were rough from hauling lumber at construction sites all day. My nights spent hunched over an old laptop, piecing together her website pixel by pixel. I'd deliver pizzas until midnight, weaving through traffic with her voice in my head, promising me we were building something real. One day, you'll own part of it too, she'd say, her eyes bright as we collapsed onto our mattress, ramen bowls balanced on our chests. I believed her. Not because I needed the money or the credit, but because I loved her. Back then, she wasn't the woman who dragged me to court to erase me from her story. Or at least, I didn't think she was. I'd come home from a 12-hour shift, my boots caked with mud, and find her sketching floor plans for her first wellness studio. She'd talk fast, words tumbling out about yoga classes and smoothie bars, her hands waving like she could already see it. I'd listen, nodding, already calculating how many extra delivery runs I'd need to cover the rent while we saved for her dream. I didn't mind. Her passion lit something in me, made the ache in my back and the blisters on my hands feel worth it. I'd spend my breaks at the construction site calling suppliers for her, haggling over prices for yoga mats and mirrors. At night, I'd design flyers, tweaking fonts until my vision blurred. Every paycheck I earned, whether from swinging a hammer, dropping off pizzas, or freelancing logos, went straight into our joint account. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt like we were a team, like every late-night talk and every dollar saved was a brick in something bigger. I remember the day we signed the lease for her first studio. The landlord was a grumpy guy with a cigar habit, and he kept eyeing me like I was the one who'd flake on the rent. I didn't care. I handed over the deposit, every cent I'd scraped together from my uncle's old truck I'd sold, and watched her face light up as she held the keys. That night, we celebrated with cheap wine and takeout, sitting cross-legged on the apartment floor. She leaned against me, her hair tickling my chin, and said, "We did this together." I felt like I could have run through a wall for her. Those early days weren't easy. The studio bled money at first. People didn't exactly flock to a no-name yoga spot in a strip mall. I took on extra shifts at a gas station to cover the losses, pumping fuel and mopping floors while she taught classes to half-empty rooms. I'd stop by after work, still in my work boots, to fix a leaky pipe or hang shelves she'd bought on clearance. Customers would give me side glances, probably wondering why the handyman was always there. I didn't care. I was proud of her, proud of us. When the studio finally turned a profit, we threw a little party. Just us, her two instructors, and a playlist blaring from my cracked phone. She grabbed my hand and pulled me into a dance, laughing like we'd cracked some secret code to the universe. I thought that was it, the start of something permanent. I didn't see the shift coming. Maybe I should have. Maybe I was too busy working, too caught up in keeping her dream alive to notice the way her smile started to fade when she looked at me. Back then, I didn't know how fast love could turn into something else, something colder, sharper. All I knew was that I'd give her everything I had, every hour, every dollar, every ounce of faith. And for a while, it felt like enough. I'd lie awake at night, her breathing soft beside me, and think about how far we'd come. From that tiny apartment to a studio with her name on the sign. I didn't need my name up there. I didn't need anyone to know what I'd done. I just needed her to remember. And for a while, I thought she would. The change didn't happen all at once. It crept in slow, like damp rot in a wall you don't notice until the whole thing's crumbling. I'd been so focused on keeping her dream afloat, I didn't see the cracks forming between us. It started when her third studio opened, a sleek spot in Manhattan that drew in influencers and corporate types with too much money. Suddenly, our life wasn't just about yoga and smoothies anymore. It was about branding and optics. And that's when her mother slid into our world like she'd been waiting for her cue. Judith had always been around, dropping by our old apartment once or twice a year with her pursed lips and her perfume that stung my nose. But back then, she'd kept her distance, maybe because we were too broke for her to bother meddling. Now, with the studios pulling in real cash, she was a regular fixture, her heels clicking through our new place like she owned it. I'd come home from a construction shift, my clothes dusted with dirt, and find her sipping tea at our kitchen counter, eyeing me like I was something the cat dragged in. "You should dress better," she'd say, not even looking up from her phone. "People talk, I'd shrug it off, too tired to argue, but it stung. I wasn't some polished guy with a degree or a corner office, and I never pretended to be. I was the guy who'd built her daughter's empire with my hands and my hustle, and I thought that was enough. But Judith had other ideas. I overheard her one night, her voice sharp as she sat with my wife in the living room. "He'll hold you back," she said, like I was a dead weight instead of the one wiring every paycheck into those studios. "You're a brand now. You need to think about who you're seen with." I stood in the hallway, my work boots still on, and felt something twist in my chest. I waited for my wife to defend me, to tell her mother she was wrong. But she didn't. She just murmured something I couldn't catch, and that silence hit harder than any insult. From then on, things shifted. My wife started going to events without me, galas, networking mixers, places where I'd stick out in my flannel and jeans. She'd come home late, her laughter lighter than it had been in years, talking about investors and partnerships. I'd ask how it went, and she'd give me a quick smile, like she was humoring me, before disappearing into her phone. I noticed she stopped wearing her wedding ring around that time. "It's just easier," she said when I asked, her voice casual, like she was talking about switching shampoo. Some clients assume I'm more approachable if I'm not flashing a ring. I didn't push it, but I felt the ground slipping under me. I kept working, though, construction by day, deliveries at night, freelance gigs when I could squeeze them in. The studios were thriving, and I was still the one handling the grunt work behind the scenes, fixing plumbing at the Brooklyn location, sourcing cheaper vendors for the juice bar, even painting walls when a new spot opened. But I wasn't her partner anymore. I was her employee, one she didn't even acknowledge. At home, our conversations dwindled to logistics, schedules, bills, nothing real. She'd talk about the brand like it was a living thing, more important than us. One night, she came back from some fancy dinner and dropped it. It's better for the brand if people think I'm single. She said it like it was no big deal, like she was asking me to pick up milk. I stood there, my hands still smelling of paint from the studio I'd touched up that morning, and stared at her. What does that mean? I asked, my voice low. She shrugged, already scrolling through her phone. It's just business. You get it. But I didn't get it. I didn't get how the woman who'd once danced with me in our tiny apartment could look at me like I was nothing. Judith's words echoed in my head. He'll hold you back. And I realized my wife believed them now. I was invisible in the empire I'd built with my blood and sweat, and worse, I was starting to feel invisible in my own life. I lay awake that night, her breathing steady beside me, and wondered where I'd gone wrong. Had I loved her too much? Worked too hard? Or had I just been too blind to see she'd outgrown me? All I knew was that the dream we'd started together wasn't mine anymore. And maybe, I was starting to think, neither was she. It was a Thursday when my world tilted. I was restocking nails and screws in the hardware store's aisle 7, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, when a guy in a cheap suit walked up. He didn't say much, just asked my name, shoved an envelope into my hands, and left without a backward glance. I stood there, a box of drywall screws still in my grip, staring at the envelope like it might bite me. I knew what it was before I even opened it. The weight of it, the way my gut twisted. Divorce papers don't feel like regular mail. I stuffed it into my back pocket and kept working, my hands moving on autopilot while my mind spun. I didn't open it until my break, sitting in the stockroom on a crate, the hum of the store muffled through the walls. The words blurred at first: dissolution of marriage, no alimony, no asset split. Then, taped to the last page, a handwritten note in her familiar scrawl. Per my lawyer's advice, you have no legal claim to the business. I read it twice, then laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so absurd I didn't know what else to do. 10 years of pouring my life into her studios, every paycheck, every late night, every callus on my hands, and she thought she could erase me with a pen and a lawyer. I folded the papers, slid them back into the envelope, and finished my shift. The guy buying lumber at the register probably thought I was nuts, smiling like I'd just won a bet instead of losing my marriage. But I wasn't smiling because I was happy. I was smiling because I remembered something she didn't. That night, I drove to the storage locker I'd rented years ago, a damp little unit crammed with boxes we'd never unpacked after moving. I hadn't been there in ages, but I knew exactly what I was looking for. Under a stack of old tax returns and sketchbooks filled with logo drafts for her first studio, I found it, a single folder, edges yellowed but intact. Inside was a contract, signed and notarized 9 years ago, back when we were still a team. She'd needed $75,000 to secure the lease for her first location, and I'd handed it over without a second thought. Every cent of the inheritance my uncle left me when he passed. I'd never seen that money as mine, not really. It was just another way to help her dream come true. In return, she'd promised me a 35% equity stake in the business. Her signature was there, bold and looping, next to mine. I sat on the concrete floor of that locker, the contract in my hands, and let the weight of it settle over me. She'd forgotten about it, buried it under her success, her new life, her mother's whispers about how I wasn't good enough. But I hadn't forgotten. I'd kept it, not because I'd planned to use it against her, but because back then, it felt like a piece of us, a promise we'd made together. I drove home with the folder on the passenger seat, the city lights streaking past like they were racing me to some finish line I couldn't see. My apartment, our apartment, though it hadn't felt like ours in months, was quiet when I got in. Her stuff was still there, designer bags and yoga mats cluttering the corners, but she wasn't. Probably at some event, smiling for photos while her lawyer prepped the next move to cut me out. I poured a glass of water, sat at the kitchen table, and read the contract again. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the years I'd given her, hauling lumber, delivering pizzas, designing her brand while she slept. It was about the nights I'd stayed up balancing our budget so she could focus on teaching classes. It was about the man I'd been, thinking love was enough to hold us together. I didn't want to destroy her. I didn't even want to hurt her, not really. But I wasn't going to let her rewrite me out of my own life. That contract was my proof, my anchor, the one thing she couldn't spin into a story that made me the villain. I tucked it into a drawer, locked it, and went to bed. For the first time in months, I slept through the night, no dreams, no tossing. The envelope from the courier sat on the counter, unanswered. Let her think I was broken. Let her think I'd sign and walk away. I wasn't signing anything yet. I had something she didn't expect, something she'd underestimated just like she'd underestimated me. And I was going to use it, not to take what was hers, but to reclaim what was mine. I wasn't the kind of guy who knew lawyers, not the way my wife did, with her Rolodex of slick suits who probably golfed with judges. My world was hardware stores and construction sites, not conference rooms and contracts. So when I walked into Camille Rivas's office, a cramped little space above a deli in Brooklyn, I felt out of place, like a stray dog wandering into a boutique. The walls were lined with books, and a single plant sat wilting in the corner, but her desk was tidy, stacked with folders and a thermos that smelled faintly of coffee. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 30s, with sharp eyes and a handshake that meant business. I'd found her through a coworker who'd said, "She's small-time but fierce, helped my cousin keep his house when his ex tried to clean him out." That was enough for me. I needed someone who'd fight, not just cash my checks. I sat across from her, the contract from the storage locker in my hands, and told her everything. 10 years of work, the studios, the divorce papers, my wife's note claiming I had no stake in her empire. My voice stayed steady, but my fingers kept folding and unfolding the edge of the folder, betraying the knot in my chest. Camille listened, jotting notes on a legal pad, her face unreadable until I slid the contract across the desk. She picked it up, scanned it, and raised an eyebrow. Did she really forget this existed? She asked, her tone somewhere between disbelief and amusement. I nodded, leaning back in the creaky chair. She forgot a lot of things. Camille's lips twitched, not quite a smile, but close. She read the contract again, slower this time, her finger tracing the lines about the $75,000 I'd invested and the 35% equity stake I'd been promised. The notary's seal was still crisp, the signatures, mine and my wife's, undeniable. "This is solid," she said, setting it down. "Not just solid, ironclad." She signed it. "You've got the receipts, and it's legally binding." For the first time in weeks, I felt my shoulders loosen, like I'd been carrying a bag of cement and someone had finally taken it off my back. I'd spent so long doubting myself, wondering if I was crazy for thinking I deserved a piece of what I'd built. But hearing her say it, seeing the certainty in her eyes, made it real. Camille leaned forward, her voice low but firm. "You're not taking from her. You're taking back what's already yours. She might have the money and the lawyers, but you've got the truth, and this." She tapped the contract. "The question is, how far do you want to go with it?" I didn't answer right away. Part of me wanted to storm into court, wave that paper in everyone's faces, and watch my wife's smirk vanish. But another part, the part that still remembered her laughing with me over cheap wine 10 years ago, just wanted this to be over, to walk away without a fight. I rubbed my jaw, the stubble rough under my fingers, and thought about the man I'd been back then. I'd given her everything, not because I wanted a reward, but because I believed in us. Now she was trying to erase me, and I couldn't let that stand. "I want what's fair," I said finally. "I don't need to ruin her, but I'm not letting her walk over me anymore." Camille nodded, like she'd expected that answer. "Fair's what will get you. Maybe more." She pulled out a notepad and started listing next steps, gathering bank records, pulling emails, tracking down anything that showed how much I'd poured into the studios. "They'll try to paint you as a freeloader," she warned. "Her team's going to come hard, make it personal. You ready for that?" I thought about the courtroom, the way my wife's mother had sneered, the way the crowd had laughed when she called me a leech. I'd spent years swallowing my pride, staying quiet while her world outgrew me. I wasn't doing that again. "I'm ready," I said, and I meant it. Camille didn't promise me a win, didn't sugarcoat it. She just laid out the plan. We'd file a counterclaim, demand my equity based on the contract, and show the court exactly how much I'd contributed. "It's not just about the money," she said as I stood to leave. "It's about making sure she can't rewrite your story." I shook her hand, feeling steadier than I had in months. Outside, the city hummed, horns blaring, people rushing past like they all had somewhere important to be. I didn't have much, not anymore. No fancy house, no big bank account, just a beat-up truck and a job that left my hands rough. But I had Camille now, and I had that contract. For the first time since those divorce papers hit my hands, I felt like I wasn't fighting alone. I drove home, the folder on the seat beside me, and let myself imagine walking into court with something to say. Not out of anger, not out of spite, but because I'd earned it. Because I wasn't invisible anymore. The courtroom felt different this time, like the air itself was holding its breath. I sat at the plaintiff's table, my tie still borrowed but pressed, my hands steady on the polished wood. Across the room, my wife was a storm of confidence, her hair perfect, her suit tailored to scream success. She leaned toward her lawyer, whispering, her eyes darting to me once, sharp and cold, before flicking away. Her mother sat behind her, pearls gleaming, muttering something that made the people nearby smirk. I caught the words pathetic and desperate, and my jaw tightened, but I didn't flinch. I'd spent too many years swallowing their poison to let it get to me now. Camille sat beside me, her notepad open, her calm like a shield I could lean into. She'd warned me this would be rough, that my wife's team would come out swinging, aiming to bury me before I could even stand. And they did. Her lawyer, a guy with a voice like he was selling luxury cars, stood and painted me as a leech who'd coasted on her brilliance. He's bitter, he said, pacing for the jury. A man who couldn't keep up with her ambition, now trying to claw his way into her success. He called me financial deadweight, and the room rippled with murmurs. I felt the eyes on me, judging, assuming he was right. My wife nodded along, her face a mask of pity, like she felt sorry for me. It was a performance, and she was good at it, always had been. Judith leaned forward, whispering to the woman next to her, loud enough for me to hear. So embarrassing. I wanted to stand up, to shout that I'd build her empire with my sweat and sacrifice, but Camille's hand brushed my arm, a quiet reminder to stay steady. We'd have our turn. The judge, an older guy with a face like weathered stone, watched it all without a word, his pen-scratching notes. When my wife's lawyer finally sat, Camille stood, her movements deliberate, like she was setting up a chessboard. She didn't raise her voice, didn't need to. Your Honor, she said, we'd like to submit evidence that tells a different story. My heart kicked up a notch as she walked to the bench, the contract in her hands. I'd handed it to her that morning, the papers still carrying the faint musty smell of the storage locker. She placed it before the judge, then turned to face the room. This is a signed, notarized agreement from 9 years ago, when my client invested $75,000, his entire inheritance, into the first of the wellness studios. In exchange, he was granted a 35% equity stake in the business. Legally binding, never revoked. The room shifted. Whispers spread like static, and I saw my wife's face freeze, her eyes narrowing as she leaned toward her lawyer, whispering furiously. He looked caught off guard, flipping through his notes like he'd missed something vital. Judith's mouth tightened, her pearls suddenly less smug. I kept my gaze forward, but inside, I felt a spark of something I hadn't in years control. Camille wasn't done. She called me to the stand, and I walked up, my boots heavy on the floor. I swore to tell the truth, my voice steady despite the eyes boring into me. She asked me to explain what I'd done for the studios, and I didn't hold back. I talked about the construction jobs I'd worked to fund the first lease, the delivery routes I'd run to cover rent, the nights I'd spent designing logos and flyers while my wife slept. I told them how I'd fixed pipes, hung mirrors, negotiated with vendors, all of it unpaid, all of it because I believed in her dream. My voice didn't waver, but my throat tightened when I said, I didn't do it for credit. I did it because I thought we were building something together. The room was quiet now, no murmurs, no smirks. Camille asked me about the $75,000, and I explained how it came from my uncle's estate, how I'd handed it over without a second thought because I trusted her. I looked at my wife then, just for a second, and saw something flicker in her eyes, guilt, maybe, or just shock that I wasn't the pushover she'd counted on. Her lawyer tried to rattle me on cross-examination, asking why I'd waited so long to suddenly claim my stake. You never mentioned this contract before, he said, his tone dripping with doubt. I leaned into the mic and said, I didn't think I'd need to. I trusted her to remember what we built. He didn't have much to say after that. When I stepped down, Camille gave me a small nod, her eyes saying we'd landed a hit. My wife's team scrambled, their confidence cracking like thin ice. Her lawyer stood again, trying to spin the contract as a misunderstanding, claiming it was outdated, irrelevant. But the judge wasn't buying it. He held the paper up, his voice dry as he said, "This looks pretty clear to me." I sat back at the table, my pulse steady now. The room that had laughed at me weeks ago was silent, the air thick with a new kind of tension. My wife wouldn't meet my eyes, her hands twisting in her lap. Judith sat rigid, her whispers gone. For the first time, I felt seen, not as the loser they'd painted, but as the man who'd built something real. Camille leaned over, her voice low. "We've got them on their heels. This isn't over yet." I nodded, my hands unclenching. I wasn't here to destroy anyone. I was here to stand up, to show I wasn't invisible. And right then, with that contract on the judge's desk, I knew I'd done it. The courtroom had a different pulse now, like the tide had turned and everyone could feel it. I sat at the table, my hands resting on the wood, no longer gripping the edges like I was holding on for dear life. Across the room, my wife's face was a mask, but I could see the cracks, her jaw tight, her eyes darting to her lawyer like he was supposed to pull a miracle out of his briefcase. Her mother sat behind her, stiff as a statue, her usual muttering silenced by the weight of what had just happened. The contract I'd pulled from that dusty storage locker had changed everything, and Camille wasn't about to let the momentum slip. She stood, her voice clear and steady, and started laying out the rest of our case, piece by piece, like she was building a house no one could tear down. I'd spent the last week digging through old files, bank statements, anything I could find to back up what I'd said on the stand. Camille had warned me her team would try to twist the truth, make it look like I was some opportunist chasing her money. So we'd come prepared, armed with proof that showed exactly how much I'd given to those studios. She started with the bank transfers, projecting them on a screen for the judge and jury to see. Every month for years, my paychecks, from construction, deliveries, freelance gigs, had gone straight into our joint account, the same one that funded her first location. "These aren't loans," Camille said, pointing to the numbers. "These are contributions, made without expectation of repayment, because my client believed he was investing in a shared future." The judge nodded slightly, his pen moving across his notepad, and I felt a flicker of hope. My wife's lawyer tried to interrupt, claiming the transfers were just household expenses, but Camille didn't flinch. She pulled up emails next, ones I'd sent to vendors in the early days, negotiating deals for yoga mats and lighting fixtures while I was on my lunch break at a construction site. One email, from me to her, read, "Got the mirrors for half price, should be up by Saturday." I remembered writing it, my hands dusty from hauling lumber, thinking I was doing something good for us. Seeing it now, blown up on a screen in front of strangers, made my chest ache, not from sadness, but from the clarity of how much I'd carried. The jury leaned forward, their faces shifting from bored to curious. Camille kept going, her voice never wavering. She showed text messages where I'd coordinated with contractors to fix leaks at the Brooklyn studio, photos of me painting walls at the Manhattan location, even a staff roster I'd helped put together when her first manager quit. "This wasn't a bystander," she said, turning to the judge. "This was a partner, in every sense of the word." I glanced at my wife then, expecting her to look angry or defiant, but her eyes were fixed on the floor, her hands twisting in her lap. For a second, I wondered if she felt it, the weight of what she'd tried to erase. But I didn't linger on it. This wasn't about her anymore. This was about me, about making sure the truth stood taller than her story. The real blow came when Camille called her accountant to the stand. He was a nervous guy, glasses slipping down his nose, clearly not thrilled to be there. She asked him about the initial investor listed in the studio's financial records, the one who'd put in $75,000 to start it all. He fidgeted, glancing at my wife's lawyer, but under oath, he couldn't lie. The investor was never removed from the books, he admitted. The name was just changed in later reports. Camille didn't miss a beat. "Changed to what?" she asked. He swallowed hard. "It was listed as an anonymous contribution." She pressed him, and he confirmed what I'd known all along. That anonymous investor was me, my $75,000 still sitting at the heart of her empire, never repaid, never acknowledged. The courtroom went dead quiet, the kind of silence that feels like it's pressing against your skin. Even the judge stopped writing, his eyes narrowing as he looked at my wife's team. Her lawyer stood, stammering about clerical errors, but it was too late. The jury wasn't buying it, and neither was I. Camille sat down beside me, her expression calm, but her eyes sharp with satisfaction. "They're unraveling," she whispered. I nodded, my throat tight. I'd spent so long feeling invisible, like my work, my sacrifice, had been buried under her success. But now, piece by piece, it was coming to light. The jury saw it. The judge saw it. And whether she admitted it or not, my wife saw it too. Her mother hadn't said a word since the accountant's testimony. Her face pale, her pearls no longer a shield. The room that had laughed at me weeks ago, that had eaten up her story of me as a deadbeat, was different now. The murmurs weren't mocking anymore. They were questions, doubts, maybe even respect. I didn't need their applause or their pity. I just needed them to see the truth. I wasn't the man she'd painted. I was the one who'd laid the foundation for everything she had, and I wasn't going to let her pretend otherwise. When the judge called a recess, Camille turned to me, her voice low. "We've got them on the ropes. You okay?" I nodded again, feeling steadier than I had in years. The courtroom emptied around us, but I stayed in my seat for a moment, letting the silence settle. I wasn't fighting for revenge or even for money. Not really. I was fighting for the man I'd been, the one who'd believed in her, who'd given everything, who deserved to be remembered. And right then, with the truth laid bare, I felt like he was finally standing tall. The courtroom felt smaller now, like the walls had closed in, trapping the truth in a space where it couldn't be ignored. I sat at the table, my hands folded, watching the judge as he leafed through his notes. His face gave nothing away, but the air was heavy, charged with the fallout of everything Camille had laid out: bank transfers, emails, the accountant's testimony, that contract I'd kept safe all those years. Across the room, my wife sat rigid, her hands gripping the edge of her table like she was trying to hold herself together. Her lawyer whispered something, but she didn't nod, didn't move. Her mother, usually a fountain of snide comments, was silent, her pearls dull under the fluorescent lights. The jury watched it all, their faces a mix of curiosity and something else, judgment, maybe, but not aimed at me this time. Camille leaned toward me, her voice low. "This is it," she said. "The ruling's coming." I nodded, my throat tight, not from fear but from the weight of what this moment meant. I'd walked into this fight expecting to lose, not because I was wrong, but because I'd spent so long believing I didn't matter. Now, with the truth spread out like bricks I'd laid myself, I felt steady, grounded. The judge cleared his throat, and the room snapped to attention. His voice was calm, almost bored, as he started laying out his decision. He went through the evidence methodically: the contract, the $75,000 I'd invested, the years of contributions I'd made to the studios. He noted how my wife's team had failed to disprove the contract's validity, how their claims of clerical errors didn't hold up against the accountant's testimony. "The evidence is clear," he said, his eyes scanning the room. "The plaintiff has a legitimate claim to 35% equity in the wellness studios, as outlined in the signed agreement." My chest loosened, like I'd been holding my breath for months and could finally exhale. But he wasn't done. He ruled that my wife had to pay me 35% of all profits retroactively, from the day the first studio opened to now, or grant me ownership shares in the business. If she wanted to avoid that, she could buy me out at market value, a number Camille had estimated could run into the millions, given how much her empire had grown. The judge's gavel came down, and the room erupted into murmurs, a low buzz that felt like static. I didn't move, didn't look at Camille or the jury or anyone. I just stared at the table, letting the words sink in. I'd won. Not just a piece of her money, but the right to be seen, to have my work acknowledged after years of being erased. My wife's lawyer stood, stammering about an appeal, but the judge waved him off, already gathering his papers. She didn't stand, didn't speak. I glanced at her then, and saw her face crumple, not the polished mask she'd worn all trial, but something raw, broken. Her eyes were wet, her hands shaking as she pressed them to her mouth. Part of me expected to feel satisfaction, maybe even triumph, watching her empire crack under the weight of the truth. But I didn't. I just felt quiet, like a storm had passed, leaving nothing but still air. Her mother was the first to move, storming out of the courtroom, her heels echoing like gunshots. The sound pulled me back, and I realized people were staring not at her, but at me. The jury, the bailiff, even the court reporter, their eyes carrying something new. Respect, maybe. Or just surprised that the guy they'd laughed at weeks ago had turned the tables. Camille touched my arm, her voice soft. "You okay?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure what okay even meant anymore. "You didn't win to hurt her," she said, reading my silence. You want to heal yourself. She was right. This wasn't about revenge, not really. It was about standing up, about refusing to let my life be rewritten as a footnote in her story. I'd spent a decade building something with her, pouring my blood and sweat into every corner of those studios, and I'd walked away with nothing but calluses and a broken marriage. Until now. As the courtroom cleared, I stayed in my seat, letting the noise fade around me. My wife's team hustled her out, her lawyer muttering about next steps, but she didn't look back. I didn't expect her to. Whatever we'd had, love, trust, a shared dream, was gone long before that gavel fell. I stood finally, my legs steady, and followed Camille toward the door. Outside, the city hummed, oblivious to what had just happened. The air was crisp, the kind of spring day that makes you want to start over. I didn't know what came next, not exactly. The money would help, sure, but it wasn't the point. The point was the man I'd become in that courtroom, the one who'd fought for himself instead of fading away. Camille walked beside me, her briefcase swinging lightly. "You did good in there," she said, her smile small but real. I didn't answer, just kept walking, the weight of the wind settling into something solid, something I could carry. I'd lost a lot: years, love, a version of myself I'd never get back. But I'd gained something too, the truth, laid bare for everyone to see. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. The air in Connecticut was different. Cleaner, quieter, like it carried less of the city's weight. I'd moved here a few months after the trial, trading my cramped Queens apartment for a small house on a street lined with oaks and picket fences. It wasn't fancy, just a two-bedroom with a porch that creaked and a backyard big enough for a grill and a chair where I could sit with a beer and watch the stars. The settlement money had made it possible, millions, more than I'd ever imagined, wired to my account after my wife chose to buy me out rather than share ownership. I didn't spend much of it, though. Didn't need to. I learned a long time ago that money doesn't fix what's broken inside. Instead, I'd started something new, something mine. I'd been sitting on the porch one night, the crickets loud and the air cool, when the idea hit me. All those years working construction, deliveries, freelance gigs, I'd learned a thing or two about hustling, about protecting what you earn. Vex gave out, hoping it was enough. I wanted to change that. So I started a side business, nothing big, just me helping blue-collar workers, carpenters, drivers, mechanics organize their money, set up savings, maybe even protect themselves from getting screwed over the way I almost had. I called it groundwork, a nod to the labor that built my life and theirs. I'd meet them at diners or their job sites, walking them through budgets or explaining contracts in plain English. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt right, like I was paying forward what I'd learned in that courtroom. I didn't talk about the trial much, didn't need to, but sometimes word got around. A guy I'd helped with his taxes, a roofer with hands as rough as mine, looked at me one day and said, "Heard you took on some big-shot yoga lady." That true? I shrugged, sipping my coffee. Something like that. He nodded, like he understood more than I'd said, and went back to his paperwork. That was enough for me. Every now and then, I'd get texts from old employees at the studios, people I hadn't heard from in years. "I had no idea you built all that," one said, a yoga instructor who'd worked the front desk back when we were still scraping by. Another, a maintenance guy I'd hired, wrote, "You deserved better, man." I didn't reply, not because I was rude, but because I didn't know what to say. Their words were kind, but they stirred up memories I'd rather let lie. Nights painting studio walls, mornings hauling equipment, her voice promising we were a team. That life was gone, and I wasn't chasing it anymore. My days settled into a rhythm. Mornings at the hardware store, where I still picked up shifts because I liked the work, afternoons meeting clients for groundwork, evenings on the porch with a book or just the quiet. I didn't need much, some groceries, a few bills, a truck that still ran fine. The settlement sat mostly untouched, growing in a savings account I'd opened with Camille's advice. "Invest it smart," she told me. "You've earned it." I was still figuring out what smart meant, but I wasn't in a rush. For the first time in years, I had time to think, to breathe, to be. I didn't follow my wife's world anymore, didn't check her social media or read the headlines about her studios. They were still there, still thriving, from what I heard. New locations, more influencers, same glossy brand. I didn't care. She built on the foundation I'd laid, and that was enough for me to know. My name was carved into those early days, whether she admitted it or not, and I didn't need her to say it out loud. Sometimes, I'd drive past a yoga studio, not hers, just some local place, and feel a pang, not for her, but for the man I'd been, the one who'd believed love could outlast ambition. I didn't hate him, didn't regret him. He'd gotten me here, to this quiet porch, this new life where I answered to myself. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky orange, I got a call from a community center in town. They'd heard about groundwork, wanted me to give a talk to local workers about managing their money. I said yes, not because I loved speaking, but because I knew what it was like to feel invisible, to work your hands raw and still wonder if it mattered. As I hung up, I leaned back in my chair, the wood creaking under me. The stars were starting to show, faint against the dusk. I thought about the trial, about standing in that courtroom, about the weight lifting when the judge's gavel fell. I'd won more than money that day. I'd won myself back, the part I'd given away without realizing it. My phone buzzed, a text from Camille, checking in like she did every few months. "You good?" it read. I typed back, "Better than good." And I meant it. I set the phone down, took a sip of my beer, and watched the sky darken. This was my life now, not perfect, not loud, but mine. And that was all I'd ever wanted. The community center smelled like old coffee and floor wax, a familiar mix that reminded me of church basements and union halls. I stood at the front of a small room, a folding table beside me covered with handouts I'd printed at the library, simple stuff about budgets, contracts, and protecting your work. About 30 people filled the metal chairs, mostly guys like me, weathered hands, work boots, faces lined from years of labor. A few women too, one with a notepad already out, another sipping from a thermos. They'd come to hear me speak at a panel called How Not to Be Erased, a title the organizer had picked because she'd heard my story through a friend of a friend. I wasn't nervous, not exactly, but my pulse ticked up as I adjusted the mic clip to my shirt. I'd never been one for speeches. Give me a hammer or a delivery route over a room full of eyes any day. But I'd said yes, because I knew what these people were carrying. The quiet fear that their work, their lives, could be swept aside without a trace. I cleared my throat, the mic crackling, and started talking. I didn't dive into the trial right away. Instead, I told them about my days hauling lumber, running pizzas through Queens, designing logos on a laptop that overheated every hour. I talked about pouring every paycheck into a dream that wasn't just mine, about believing in a partnership that felt bigger than money. My voice stayed steady, the words coming easier than I'd expected. I didn't name her, didn't need to. This wasn't about her anymore. It was about the years I'd spent building something, only to watch it slip through my fingers when the rules changed. The room was quiet, but not the bored kind of quiet. They leaned forward, nodding when I described late nights balancing budgets or fixing leaks at the studios while my wife taught classes. I told them about the contract, how I'd found it in a storage locker, how it proved I'd invested $75,000 and earned a 35% stake in a business that grew into millions. I didn't linger on the courtroom drama, just said I'd fought for what was mine and walked away with enough to start over. It wasn't about the money, I said, my hands resting on the table. It was about making sure my work meant something, that I wasn't just a shadow in someone else's story. A guy in the back, his cap pulled low, raised his hand. "How'd you know when to fight?" he asked, his voice rough. I thought about it, remembering the divorce papers hitting my hands, the note saying I had no claim. When I realized I'd given everything and was being told it was nothing, I said, "That's when you stand up, not for revenge, but for yourself." He nodded, scribbling something down. I kept going, sharing what I'd learned through groundwork, my side business helping workers like them. I told them to keep records of their hours, their contributions, their deals. "Paperwork's boring until it saves you," I said, and a few chuckled. I warned them about trusting too much, about love or loyalty blinding you to your own worth. "Don't wait until you're in court to realize you were the architect all along," I said, and the room went still, like I'd hit a nerve. When I finished, they clapped. Not a roaring ovation, but a solid, real kind of applause that felt earned. People came up after, shaking my hand, asking questions about contracts or savings plans. A carpenter with gray in his beard said, "I'm going to start tracking my side jobs better because of you." I nodded, feeling something warm settle in my chest. Not pride, but purpose. As the room emptied, I packed up my handouts, the mic still clipped to my shirt. Camille had slipped in during the Q&A, standing at the back with her arms crossed, a small smile on her face. She didn't say anything until we were outside, the night air cool against my skin. "You were good in there," she said, her voice light. "Didn't know you had it in you." I laughed, the first real laugh I'd let out in a while. Neither did I. We walked to my truck, the stars sharp above us. She didn't ask about the trial or the settlement, didn't need to. She'd been there, seen me at my lowest, helped me stand tall when I thought I'd break. "You're building something real with this," she said, nodding toward the community center. "Not just for them, for you." I didn't answer right away, just unlocked my truck and tossed my bag inside. She was right, though. Groundwork, this talk, the quiet life I'd carved out in Connecticut. It wasn't about proving anything to my wife or her mother or the world. It was about proving something to myself, that I could keep going, that I could be more than the man who'd lost everything. I drove home, the road dark and familiar, my thoughts drifting to the past but not lingering there. The trial felt distant now, like a storm I'd weathered long ago. The money was in the bank, the studios were hers, and I was here, in a life I'd chosen. I didn't hate her, didn't wish her ill. I just didn't need her anymore. Not her approval, not her empire, not her story. When I pulled into my driveway, the porch light was on, casting a soft glow over the creaky steps. I sat in the truck for a minute, letting the quiet wrap around me. This was my legacy, not a name on a building, not a headline, but a life built on my terms. I'd been erased once, but I'd written myself back in, line by line, choice by choice. And as I stepped out, the stars bright above, I knew that was enough. I never really thought about my life in terms of big moments or grand changes. I was just living, an average office worker, just like hundreds of thousands of others out there, going through the motions. Wake up, get dressed, grab a coffee, punch in at the office, and repeat. The only break in the monotony was the occasional happy hour after work, but even those felt more like a formality than anything I looked forward to. I could dream of climbing the corporate ladder. Everyone dreams of that, don't they? But there was a certain resignation to my routine. No matter how many times I tried to push myself, something always held me back. I didn't have that spark of ambition, that drive to outsmart the competition, or to push the boundaries of what was possible. Instead, I found myself constantly volunteering for the tasks that no one else wanted. I'd fill in the gaps, meet deadlines, handle the mundane. No one ever asked much of me, and I never put much more into it. It was safe. It was comfortable, but it wasn't going anywhere. I think that's what I'd always wanted, to be honest. I didn't need a corner office or a massive salary. I wanted stability, routine, something I could count on. So, when my supervisor asked me to help out with an extra report on top of my usual load, I said yes without hesitation, even though I knew it would push me closer to exhaustion. I didn't know how to say no. It wasn't that I didn't want to. It was more that I didn't know how to assert myself. I didn't know how to demand more for the work I put in. And so, I continued as the guy who was always there, the guy who could be relied on to get the job done, but never the guy to get promoted. I had a few dreams here and there, like everyone else. I told myself that one day, I'd figure it out, that I'd somehow find the courage to make a leap, to change my life. But that day never seemed to come. I kept looking for shortcuts, some easy path to success, but there was none. There was just work. Work, home, work. A rhythm that had become ingrained, something I had almost stopped questioning. Maybe this was all I was destined to be. A regular employee in a world full of those who were more driven, more determined. But I never truly blamed anyone else. It wasn't their fault that I had settled into this life. It was my own doing. I had chosen this path. I had chosen to play it safe. That's how my life felt, safe. No thrills. No huge victories. Just existing, one day at a time. Isabella came into my life when everything seemed like it was in its right place. We met at a mutual friend's party, the kind that neither of us really wanted to go to, but somehow found ourselves at. There was something magnetic about her. She had a charm, a presence that made everyone stop and listen when she spoke. It didn't take long before we became inseparable. She had this way of making me feel like I was the most important person in the room, like I was the one who mattered. It felt good to be chosen by someone who had so much going for her. Someone so clearly ambitious, someone with the drive to succeed. At first, everything was perfect. Our dates were simple but meaningful. A walk through the park, a night at the movies, long talks over dinner. We shared our dreams and our fears, and for a while, I thought we had everything figured out. She was my partner in everything. And I? I was just happy to be there, content in our small world, believing that we had a future. We got married sooner than I had expected, but I didn't question it. Why would I? I thought it was a natural next step. I thought we'd continue to build something beautiful together. After all, we were in our early 20s, the world was ahead of us, and we had all the time to make it work. Or so I thought. But then, things started to change. It wasn't sudden. It was gradual, like the slow shift of the tide that you only notice when you look back. Isabella's ambitions were no longer about just us. Our lives, our shared dreams. Her goals became centered on herself. She wanted more. More luxury. More beauty. More things. She was no longer content with simple nights at home. She craved designer clothes, high-end beauty treatments, vacations to places I could barely afford. And here I was, stuck in the same office job, taking on tasks that no one else wanted. I could never seem to push myself beyond the average, beyond the comfortable. I knew what Isabella wanted from me, but I couldn't give it to her. I didn't have the drive to push forward. I was content, and she wasn't. The tension grew over time. There were arguments, silent ones at first, ones where she would drop subtle hints that she wasn't happy with the way things were going. And then there were the loud ones, where she would accuse me of not trying hard enough, of not being the man she needed me to be. She told me she wanted more excitement, more success, more everything, and I couldn't provide it. She would buy things, expensive things, and look at me with disappointment when I couldn't keep up. I'd try to justify my shortcomings, but deep down, I knew she was right. I wasn't the man she needed. I was too comfortable in my mediocrity, too content with the predictable routine of life, while she was out there chasing her own success. I think part of me knew the writing was on the wall. I could see the way she looked at me sometimes, like I wasn't enough, like I was a disappointment. But I never had the courage to face it. I thought I could fix it. I thought I could become the man she wanted me to be, the man she deserved. But no matter how hard I tried, I never measured up. Our marriage, once built on love, began to crumble under the weight of her expectations and my inability to meet them. The moments of joy became fewer and further between, replaced by frustration, silence, and resentment. I wasn't just disappointing her. I was disappointing myself. Still, I didn't want to let go. I thought if I just worked harder, tried harder, maybe things would turn around. Maybe I could fix this. But she didn't see it that way. One night, after a particularly heated argument about money and the life she felt she deserved, Isabella told me that she couldn't do this anymore. She needed more than I could give her. She needed someone who could provide for her, who could offer her the life she wanted, the luxury, the excitement. I wasn't that person, and I wasn't ever going to be. I begged her to reconsider. I promised her that things would change, that I would change. But she was done. And with that final word, she ended it. The silence that followed was deafening, and in that silence, I felt the weight of my failure. The divorce papers arrived a week later, and they were like a slap to the face, a stark reminder that I hadn't been enough. I was left with nothing but a broken heart and an empty home. Isabella, with her new life, was gone, and I was left to pick up the pieces of a marriage I had failed to save. It wasn't just the loss of her that hurt. It was the realization that I had been living in a dream, thinking that everything would work out, thinking that love was enough. But love wasn't enough. Not when ambition and expectations outgrew the reality we lived in. As she walked away, I couldn't help but feel like I had failed her, failed myself, and failed everything I had worked so hard to build. And all I could do was watch her go, knowing that I had lost the one person who had ever truly mattered to me. And so there I was, alone, broken, left with nothing but the remnants of a life I had thought would last forever. The days following Isabella's departure were the longest of my life. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly, each hour marked by an absence I couldn't ignore. Her absence was everywhere, lingering in the corners of the apartment, in the empty side of the bed, in the quiet moments I used to fill with her voice. The silence felt like a constant weight, pressing down on me, suffocating me. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't escape the fact that I had lost everything. I spent the first few days in a kind of haze, trying to function, trying to do the things I knew I had to do. I went to work, of course. I always went to work, but it wasn't the same. It felt empty, like everything in my life had lost its meaning. My coworkers noticed something was off, but they didn't ask. I wasn't the type to share personal details with anyone. I kept to myself, the same way I always had. The divorce papers arrived a week after Isabella left, and I felt like I was being handed a death sentence. It wasn't just the legal document that hurt, it was the finality of it. There was no going back. There was no fixing what had been broken. It was done. I signed the papers, feeling numb as I did so. There was nothing left to say, no words that could make any of this better. I had failed her. I had failed myself. I had failed us. I kept thinking about the last conversation we had, about the words she'd said to me before walking out the door. "I need more than you can give me, James," she had told me. "I need a life that excites me. I need a future that feels worth living." Those words cut deeper than any knife ever could. Because deep down, I knew she was right. I wasn't the man she needed. I had always been content with what we had, even though it wasn't enough for her. I had failed to see that she needed more than stability. She needed adventure. She needed the kind of life that came with ambition, with drive, with the ability to go after what you want, no matter the cost. I had never been that person, and I had never been able to admit that to myself until it was too late. The nights were the worst. That's when the loneliness hit hardest. I would lie awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of our relationship in my mind. I thought about the early days when everything felt effortless, when we were happy, when we shared dreams of the future. But somewhere along the way, those dreams had started to slip away. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped being the man she wanted me to be. I wasn't ambitious enough for her. I wasn't driven enough. I didn't have the spark that would have lit up the future we had dreamed about. And I couldn't fix that. I couldn't give her what she wanted because, at the end of the day, I wasn't sure I even knew what I wanted for myself. I had built my life around her expectations, around the idea of what we could become together. But in the end, I had only built a life of mediocrity, one that lacked excitement, one that lacked ambition. And it wasn't just her that had suffered because of that. I had too. I had spent years coasting through life, thinking that stability and routine were enough, but I was wrong. The truth was, I had never really been living. I had been existing, holding on to the comfort of familiarity, too afraid to take risks, too afraid to push myself beyond what was safe. But now, with the pieces of my life scattered around me, I had no choice but to face the truth. The truth was that I wasn't just losing Isabella. I was losing myself. The weeks after the divorce passed in a blur. I focused on work, burying myself in my tasks, trying to keep my mind occupied. But no matter how much I worked, it never felt like enough. The quiet at home was deafening, and the guilt of everything that had gone wrong hung over me like a dark cloud. I couldn't escape it. There were moments when I thought about reaching out to her, to try and fix things, to beg her to come back. But I knew I couldn't. It wasn't just the fact that she had left, it was that she had already moved on. I was just a part of her past now, a chapter in her life that she was closing, one she was eager to forget. And I wasn't sure I could blame her. I wasn't the man she needed. I wasn't the man I had wanted to be. I had let her down, and in doing so, I had let myself down too. One evening, about 2 months after she had left, I sat down to write a letter. It wasn't a letter to her. It wasn't even a letter to anyone in particular. It was a letter to myself, a letter to remind myself that, despite everything, I was still here, that I could still move forward. I wrote about all the mistakes I had made, about how I had let my fear of change hold me back. I wrote about the dreams I had once had, dreams of climbing the corporate ladder, of achieving something more than just a regular office job. I wrote about how I had stopped believing in those dreams, how I had stopped trying. And I wrote about the future. A future I was determined to build, one where I wasn't defined by what I had lost, but by what I could still achieve. It wasn't easy to admit, but I realized that I wasn't ready to give up on myself. I had spent so much time thinking that I was stuck, thinking that I was destined to live a life of mediocrity, but the truth was that I still had time. Time to build something for myself. Time to rediscover the person I used to be before I became so consumed by what I thought I needed. I folded the letter and put it in my drawer, but I never threw it away. It was my reminder, the thing I needed to remind myself that I could still start over, that I could still rebuild. It was a small step, but it was a step forward. When Isabella and I first got married, I thought that was it. Everything I needed, everything I wanted, was right there. I had a wife, a home, and the promise of a future. But in the end, that wasn't enough. And now, it felt like I was chasing something I couldn't quite grasp, something just out of reach. But I couldn't stay in this place of grief forever. I couldn't let the emptiness consume me. I had to find a way to rebuild, to create something out of the wreckage of my life. The first thing I did was take a long look at the apartment. It was small, but it had been our home for a while. It held memories, good and bad. The smell of her perfume was still in the air, and the ghost of her laughter lingered in the corners of the rooms. But I couldn't stay there, trapped in the past. It was time to make it mine again. I started with the little things, changing the layout of the furniture, rearranging the pictures on the walls. I took down the wedding photos, replacing them with neutral art that didn't remind me of what I had lost. I threw away the things I didn't need, the things that had become symbols of my failure. It was a slow process, but each day I felt a little lighter. Each day, I removed a little more of her presence from my life, and with it, I began to find myself again. But it wasn't just the apartment that needed to change. It was me. For the first time in years, I started taking a hard look at myself. I started asking questions I had avoided for far too long. What was I doing with my life? Why had I let it get to this point? Why had I stayed so stuck in the same rut for so long? The truth was, I had been afraid of change, afraid of failing, afraid of taking risks. I had lived a life of safety, of doing what was expected, but now I realized that was never going to be enough. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine while I watched my dreams wither away. I enrolled in an online course for project management, something that had always intrigued me, something I thought I could be good at if I just applied myself. It wasn't a drastic change, but it was something. It was a small step toward proving to myself that I was still capable of growth, of learning, of moving forward. Every evening after work, I'd sit down at the small desk in my apartment and go over my lessons, working through the material, absorbing everything I could. It felt good to do something, to invest in myself again. It was the first time in years that I had felt like I had control over my future. But the road wasn't easy. I still struggled with the memories of Isabella, still fought with the guilt that I wasn't the man she had needed. I could hear her voice in my head, accusing me of not being enough, of not providing the life she had dreamed of. But I pushed those thoughts aside. I couldn't let her expectations dictate my life anymore. As the weeks passed, I started seeing the results of my hard work. I was getting better at my job, taking on more responsibilities, and even starting to be recognized for my efforts. It wasn't a promotion yet, but I was closer than I had ever been. I wasn't just another cog in the machine anymore. I was becoming someone who had something to offer. And then, one afternoon, I received a call from my manager. "James, we've been impressed with your progress lately," she said. "We're thinking about offering you a lead position on an upcoming project. We'd like you to take on more responsibility." For the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. It was the validation I had been seeking, the confirmation that I was capable of more than just being the guy who gets things done but never gets ahead. I accepted the offer without hesitation, a smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. It wasn't the corner office or the financial freedom I had once dreamed of, but it was something. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where I wasn't defined by my past mistakes, by my failures, or by the woman who had left me behind. But it wasn't just the job that had changed. I had changed. I had stopped waiting for things to happen and started making them happen. I wasn't going to let my past define me anymore. Over the next few months, I worked harder than I ever had before. I poured myself into the project, learning everything I could, proving to myself that I wasn't just someone who could sit by and accept mediocrity. I was someone who could excel, who could take on challenges and rise above them. I didn't hear from Isabella during this time, and to be honest, I didn't want to. I didn't need her validation anymore. I didn't need to prove anything to her. I was proving it to myself. I kept my head down, focused on the work ahead of me. There were days when I wanted to give up, when the pressure of it all felt overwhelming. But then I'd remember the nights I spent lying awake in that empty bed, the guilt that had eaten away at me, and I'd push forward. I wasn't going to be the man I had been before. I was going to be someone new, someone better. And slowly, but surely, I started to see the results. The project was a success. The recognition I had been craving came, and with it, the promise of more opportunities, more growth. I had done it, but it wasn't just about the work. It was about proving to myself that I could overcome my failures, that I could build something new from the wreckage of my past. I had learned something important through all of this. Life doesn't stop when things fall apart. You can rebuild. You can start over. And sometimes, when you've lost everything, you find out who you really are. And that's when you start to live again. It had been a year since Isabella walked out of my life, leaving nothing but a void where the future we'd once dreamed about had been. The sting of the divorce was still there, but it had dulled, like a wound that had started to heal but hadn't quite closed yet. I had made progress, work was going well, and I had a new sense of purpose. But there were still days when I found myself looking at the empty space where she used to be, wondering what went wrong, wondering if things could have been different. I wasn't looking for any more reminders of my past, but life had a way of throwing things at you when you least expected it. One morning, an envelope arrived, the kind that you don't get every day, cream-colored, sealed with an elegant emblem. I didn't recognize the handwriting, and for a moment, I thought it might be some sort of mistake. But as I tore open the envelope, I found the last thing I expected, a wedding invitation. Isabella's wedding invitation. I stared at the embossed letters on the card, my heart sinking before I could even process the rest of the words. She was remarried. I had expected it, in some distant part of my mind, but seeing it written in front of me, the formality of it, the cold finality, it hit harder than I imagined. Maxwell. The name was unfamiliar, and yet somehow it felt like an insult. She had moved on so quickly, and here I was, still grappling with the mess she had left behind. I was consumed by a mix of emotions, anger, confusion, a sense of helplessness, but also something I wasn't ready to admit, curiosity. Why had she sent this to me? Was it out of some twisted sense of guilt, or was she simply trying to rub it in my face? I couldn't tell, but there was something about this invitation, about the gesture of sending it, that felt almost mocking. Maybe she thought I needed closure. Maybe she thought it was the right thing to do, to let me know she was moving on. But why? What did she want from me? What was the point of this? For a while, I thought about throwing the invitation away, ignoring it, pretending it didn't exist. But I couldn't. I needed answers. I needed to understand what had happened between us, and this felt like the universe's way of making me confront the past. I decided to go. Part of me wanted to tell myself I was doing it for closure. Another part, the more honest part, knew it was because I needed to see her. I needed to see the life she had built without me, to see how easily she had slipped into this new world. I wasn't sure what I was hoping for, whether I wanted to find some sort of validation for my pain or simply to confirm the finality of it all. The night of the wedding arrived, and I found myself standing outside the venue, unsure of what I was expecting to find. The location was beautiful, an elegant, sprawling estate, the kind of place that was clearly meant for luxury, for people who had everything. It made sense, of course. Isabella had always wanted the best, and Maxwell clearly fit the bill. As I walked into the reception hall, I was struck by the opulence of it all. The flowers, the lighting, the carefully arranged seating. All of it screamed excess. I stood at the entrance for a moment, taking it all in, feeling a sense of distance from it all. None of this was for me. She deserved someone who could give her the life she wanted. James just couldn't keep up. I froze. The words hit me harder than anything else in that moment. I felt the sting of judgment, the harsh reality of my shortcomings laid out before me. These people didn't know the whole story. They didn't know that it wasn't just about money or luxury. It was about love, about connection, about building something real together. But Isabella had never wanted that. She had wanted the lifestyle, the flash, the admiration. She had wanted more, and I wasn't enough. I tried to shake off the sting of their words, but it wasn't easy. I felt the familiar bitterness rise up again, the anger that I had tried so hard to bury. But there was something else, something I hadn't expected. I felt nothing. I felt no desire to fight for her. No urge to convince myself that I could have been the man she needed. There was no more anger, no more heartbreak. There was only a sense of quiet acceptance. This was her choice, and I wasn't going to fight it anymore. I didn't need her approval. I didn't need to prove anything to her or anyone else. And for the first time in years, I felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Peace. It wasn't much, but it was there. I looked around the room, seeing Isabella laughing with her new husband, her new life. And I walked away. I couldn't say I was surprised when I saw Isabella again at her wedding. In fact, as I watched her move through the crowd, it almost felt as though I had been waiting for this moment for a long time. It wasn't a sense of yearning or regret that gripped me. It was something else, something colder. The pieces of my life that had been scattered and lost over the years suddenly seemed to click into place. I stood at the back of the room, watching her. Her every movement graceful and confident, as if she had always been the center of this world. Maxwell, her new husband, stood beside her, looking at her with admiration that I hadn't been able to provide. The chemistry between them was undeniable. It was the kind of love I thought we had, the kind that made everything else fade into the background. But that wasn't our story, was it? Ours had been something different, something less glamorous. And for the first time, I realized how much of it had been my fault. The guests laughed and clinked glasses, enjoying themselves, and I couldn't help but overhear snippets of their conversations. Some of them were talking about the past, about how everything had come together for Isabella. Some of them were curious about the divorce, asking questions in hushed voices, wondering what had gone wrong. I heard one woman remark on how lucky Isabella was to have moved on so quickly, as if her life had just snapped into place while mine had crumbled. But it wasn't just the gossip that caught my attention. It was what I overheard next, a conversation between a couple standing nearby, laughing as they discussed Isabella's former life. "I don't know why she ever married James," one of the men said, his voice dripping with condescension. "He could never give her what she wanted. She needed someone who could provide the lifestyle she deserved. And James, well, he never seemed to want that." My chest tightened as I heard the words. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. There it was again, the insinuation that I was never enough for her, that I had somehow failed, that I hadn't been the kind of man she wanted. I had spent so many years questioning myself, wondering if I had been too comfortable, too predictable for her. And in this moment, standing in the midst of these people who had never truly known me, I was hearing it all over again. "She deserves more than him," another voice added. "I always thought she'd end up with someone like Maxwell, someone who knows how to make things happen, someone who doesn't settle." And there it was, the truth, the cruel, biting truth that had been there all along, but I had refused to see. Isabella had never loved me for who I was. She loved the idea of what I could give her: stability, predictability, a steady job that she could depend on. But that wasn't enough for her. She wanted more, and I could never give her that. I stood there, frozen in place, as the laughter from the guests swirled around me. My mind raced with thoughts of the past, of the years I had spent trying to make her happy, trying to be the man she wanted me to be. I had tried so hard to be enough, to be the person who could provide the life she craved. But in the end, none of that mattered. She had found someone else who could give her everything she wanted, someone who could offer the life she had dreamed of, and I had nothing left. My gaze drifted back to Isabella, who was talking to Maxwell's parents. She looked happy, radiating the kind of confidence I had never been able to provide for her. She didn't look back at me. She didn't need to. I watched as she laughed at something Maxwell said, her eyes lighting up, her smile wide and genuine. It was as though the years we had spent together had never happened. It was as though I had never mattered at all. And that's when it hit me. She had never truly loved me. Not for who I was. Not for the person I had been. She had loved the idea of what we could be. She had loved the stability I offered, the promise of a comfortable life. But that wasn't love. That was something else, something shallow, something transactional. I had spent so many years convincing myself that if I just worked harder, if I just became more of what she wanted, she would love me. But I had been wrong. She didn't love me for me. She loved what I could provide. And when I couldn't provide it anymore, she left. I stood there for a long while, feeling the weight of the realization settle over me. There were no grand epiphanies, no dramatic confrontations. It was just a quiet acceptance of the truth. I wasn't the man she wanted, and that was okay. I didn't need to be. I turned and left the venue without a word, without a second glance. I didn't need to be a part of her life anymore. I didn't need to prove anything to her. The life I had been living had never truly been mine, and I was finally ready to step away from it. I was done living in her shadow, done being the man who couldn't measure up. I was ready to rebuild my life on my own terms. And as I walked away from that wedding, I felt something shift within me. It wasn't relief, exactly. It was something else, something deeper. I felt the weight of the past lifting off my shoulders, slowly but surely. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't broken. I was free. I spent the rest of the evening at Isabella's wedding feeling like an intruder in someone else's life. The sharp, suffocating realization that I was no longer a part of her world hung over me like a dark cloud, and no amount of mingling with the guests could shake it off. I wanted to leave, to escape the noise, to stop pretending that I was okay. But there I was, still in the midst of it all, watching her laugh with her new husband, seeing the life she had built without me. It wasn't until later in the evening, when most of the guests had moved to the dance floor, that I overheard something that would shatter everything I had believed about our marriage. I was standing near the bar, nursing a glass of water, trying to make sense of the emotions swirling inside me when I caught a snippet of conversation from two older women standing behind me. I never understood what she saw in James. One of them was saying, he was always so predictable, so safe, not exciting like Maxwell. The other woman laughed softly, the sound of it laced with judgment. Well, he was good for her at first. He provided, kept her stable. But she wasn't meant for that kind of life. She needed more. More adventure, more glamour. James couldn't give her that. The words were like a punch to the gut. I didn't need to hear them, but I couldn't escape them. They echoed in my mind as if I had been slapped across the face. I had always known, deep down, that Isabella had outgrown me. I had known she was disappointed in me. But hearing it from someone else, someone who didn't even know the whole story, made the truth feel so much sharper, so much more real. I tried to shake it off, to ignore the sting of their words, but it was impossible. What hurt the most wasn't that they were saying it. It was that I had heard it all before. I had heard it in Isabella's eyes, in her voice when she spoke about what she wanted out of life. I had heard it in the way she would sigh when I couldn't meet her expectations. I had known, for a long time, that I wasn't the man she needed me to be. But now, standing there in the shadows of their conversation, it was all coming together. Isabella hadn't loved me for who I was. She had loved the version of me that fit into the life she envisioned. Stable, predictable, someone who could provide for her. She hadn't cared about my dreams or my ambitions. She had cared about what I could give her. And when I couldn't give her what she wanted anymore, she had left. I felt a wave of nausea rise in my chest, the truth of it crashing over me like a tidal wave. She had never really been in love with me. She had been in love with the idea of a life we could create together, a life that she had outgrown once she realized there was more to be had. More wealth, more excitement, more everything. And I had been just a placeholder in her life, a person who was easy to fall in line with until she realized there was something bigger, something better. I looked across the room at Isabella, laughing and dancing with Maxwell, her arm draped around him as they shared a private moment. Her happiness was infectious, but all I could see was the distance between us, the gap that had widened over the years until it was too late to close. I had been nothing more than a stepping stone for her, a way to achieve the life she had always dreamed of. And now that she had it, I was no longer needed. I was just the man who had failed to keep up with her expectations. As the night wore on, the conversation that had haunted me earlier began to replay in my mind over and over again. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I couldn't pretend that what had happened between us was anything other than what it was. A mismatch of desires, a failed attempt to live up to a version of love that never existed. When the final toast was made and the last song played, I found myself standing on the edge of the venue, watching as the guests slowly began to leave, their laughter and chatter drifting away in the distance. I was supposed to be happy for Isabella. I was supposed to be glad that she had found the life she wanted. But instead, I felt empty. I felt like a ghost, watching from the sidelines, unable to find a place where I belonged. I wanted to leave. I wanted to walk out of that room and never look back. But I stayed. For one last moment, I wanted to see her, to see the woman I had loved so deeply, and accept the truth that I had been holding back for so long. But as I looked at her, I realized something else. I didn't need her anymore. Not in the way I once thought I did. The truth was, I had been holding on to a memory, to a version of her that no longer existed. I had been holding on to a dream that was never meant to be. I took a deep breath, knowing that it was time to let go. I had spent so many years trying to keep up with her expectations, trying to be the man I thought she wanted. But in the end, I was only fooling myself. I had to stop living for her approval, and start living for myself. I turned to leave the venue, my footsteps echoing in the hallway as I walked out into the night. The air was cool against my skin, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of freedom. The weight of the past, of Isabella's expectations, was finally beginning to lift. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid. I wasn't stuck in the past, mourning the life I had lost. I was free to build something new, something of my own. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. I had expected that leaving Isabella's wedding would bring me some sense of finality, but what followed that night was anything but closure. The truth about what had been happening in my life, and the realization that I had been living in a shadow for so long, still weighed on me. I wasn't angry anymore. I was just lost. But that night, at the wedding, something unexpected happened. Something that would change everything. I had stepped outside for a moment, needing to clear my head, to get away from the celebration, the laughter, the crowd of people who didn't know me. The cool night air hit me like a wave, soothing the knot of emotions tightening in my chest. It was just the kind of quiet I needed, a moment of peace to gather my thoughts. But as I stood there, I felt a presence behind me. A voice, calm but authoritative, called my name. James. I turned to find William, Maxwell's father, standing a few feet away. He wasn't someone I had spoken to before, but I knew who he was. His presence seemed out of place here, at least to me. He looked around briefly, almost nervously, before stepping closer to me. "I'm sorry to intrude," he said, his tone tentative, but with an underlying urgency. "I've been meaning to speak with you." I didn't know what to make of it. His presence felt unexpected, like a random piece in a puzzle that didn't fit, but there was something in his expression that made me hesitate. I was already bracing myself for another uncomfortable conversation with someone who had no real understanding of the pain I was carrying, but William's next words stopped me in my tracks. "Are you James Walker, the son of Dr. Walker?" he asked carefully, his eyes scanning my face for some kind of confirmation. I nodded, still unsure of where this conversation was heading. William's face seemed to pale a little as recognition set in. He stepped forward, his posture stiff, but then his shoulders slumped as though some weight had suddenly landed on him. He looked as though he had just come to realize something heavy, something significant, and he couldn't escape it. "I never expected to see you here," William said, his voice softer now. "It's a bit ironic, really." I was taken aback by his words. Irony? What could he possibly mean? I was ready to dismiss him, to walk away from yet another awkward encounter at a wedding that had already drained me, but there was something in his voice that kept me there. "Why ironic?" I asked. Curiosity overcoming William hesitated, his hands shifting nervously as if he was unsure of how to continue. There was a look of discomfort on his face, as though he were about to reveal something deeply personal, something he had carried for a long time. "Because your father," he began, his voice trailing off as if gathering his thoughts. "Your father saved my son's life. Maxwell's life." I blinked, caught off guard by the words. Maxwell's father? Saving Maxwell? I had known Maxwell for only a short while, just enough to see that he had everything I never did. Confidence, ambition, success. He was Isabella's future now, her new life. and I had been nothing more than the backdrop to their past. The man standing before me, though, was a figure from Maxwell's life who I had never once considered. It felt so surreal, so out of place to think of my father in this context. "You, what do you mean?" I stammered, my pulse quickening. This conversation was suddenly spiraling in directions I wasn't prepared for. William took a deep breath, seemingly weighed down by a burden he had been carrying for years. His eyes looked away from me, and for a moment, it seemed as though he were gathering strength to speak the truth. Many years ago, Maxwell was involved in a serious car accident. He was on the verge of losing his life. "James," William explained, his voice thick with emotion, "your father performed a life-saving surgery, one that no one thought would work. It was a critical situation, and without his skill, Maxwell wouldn't have made it. He didn't just save my son's life, James, he gave me my son back." I stood there, stunned. I had no idea. I didn't know my father had played such a pivotal role in someone else's life, let alone Maxwell's. I had always seen my father as someone quietly devoted to his work, his patients, but never had I known the extent of his impact. Maxwell's father looked down at his hands, his expression becoming more somber as the weight of his confession grew heavier. "Afterward, I promised your father I would repay the debt. I promised I would do anything in my power to show my gratitude," William continued, his voice wavering slightly. "But after your father passed away, I lost touch with you, James. I lost track of everything. And now I realize how much time has passed and how much I still owe to you." The air around us felt thick, and I could hardly process what I was hearing. My father had saved Maxwell's life, and now, standing before me, was a man who felt indebted to me because of that? The irony of it was almost too much to grasp. I had always believed that the world my father had been a part of was distant from mine, clinical, detached, wrapped in the sterile environment of hospitals and operating rooms. I never realized how deeply his influence had stretched, how his kindness had reverberated beyond just our family. The world had always seemed like a place where things happened by chance, where we drifted along, caught in the flow of events. But now, with William's words, I could see how interconnected it all was. How everything had meaning, even the most unremarkable moments. And now, that connection was coming back to me in the most unexpected way. William's gaze met mine, filled with genuine remorse. "I don't know how to make up for all the time I've lost, for the debt I still owe to your father," he said, voice thick with regret. "But I want to make it right. I want to make sure that you, too, can benefit from what he did. I know it's not much, but I want to help. I want to repay this debt." I stood there in stunned silence, trying to make sense of everything. My father had saved Maxwell's life, saved the man who was now married to my ex-wife, living the life I had always dreamed of. It felt like the universe had somehow conspired to bring me back to the very thing I had been running from. And now here was Maxwell's father, offering me something I had never expected. An opportunity. William reached into his pocket and pulled out a card. He handed it to me, the weight of his gesture tangible in the air between us. "Take this," William said quietly. "It's my personal number. I don't know what kind of help you need, James, but I can help you. I owe it to you and your father." I took the card, though I had no idea what I was supposed to do with it. But in that moment, I realized that maybe this wasn't just a coincidence. Maybe this was the moment I had been waiting for, the chance to build something new, to take back what had been taken from me. I had spent so many years thinking I wasn't enough, thinking I couldn't change my life. But now, it felt like the door to something new had opened. "I don't know what to say," I said quietly, looking at the card in my hand. "I didn't expect this. I didn't expect any of this." William gave me a weary smile. "I didn't expect it either. But sometimes life has a way of making us face the things we avoid, the things we don't want to deal with." I nodded, still processing everything. The weight of his words wasn't lost on me. I had avoided so much of my life, so much of the potential I had inside of me, because I had been afraid. Afraid of failure. Afraid of never being enough. But now, here was an opportunity. A chance to step into something larger than myself, something bigger than the life I had once settled for. "I'll think about it," I said, Though I knew deep down that I would have to take that step, I had to. As William walked away, disappearing into the crowd of guests, I stood there, alone again, but not quite as empty. Something had shifted inside me. There was a path forward. Maybe it wasn't going to be easy. Maybe it wasn't going to be perfect, but it was mine. And for the first time in years, I felt like I had a choice. The weeks following the wedding were a blur. I kept replaying my conversation with William in my mind. The shock of it all, the way he had opened up to me in a way I never expected. It felt like a strange twist of fate, a turn in my life I hadn't seen coming. But as much as I tried to focus on the future, a part of me couldn't stop thinking about the past, about Isabella, about Maxwell, and about the life I had lost. And then, one evening, just as I was starting to feel like I could finally breathe again, I received a message from an unexpected source. Maxwell? It came as a simple text, just a few lines of words, but they carried a weight that I wasn't prepared for. It wasn't long after I had finished work, and I was sitting in my apartment, quietly processing the progress I had made in my life so far. The text felt like an intrusion, a reminder of the past I had been trying to leave behind. James, I know this may come as a surprise, but I wanted to reach out. I'm sorry for everything. I don't know if you'll ever forgive me, but I wanted to apologize. You deserve to know the truth. I stared at the screen, my thoughts spinning. The words themselves were simple, but the implications were staggering. Apologize? For what? What had Maxwell, of all people, possibly owed me an apology for? He hadn't done anything to me directly, not in a way that could be pointed to, at least. He hadn't been the one who ended our marriage. But I knew better than anyone that an apology wasn't always about being directly at fault. It was about taking responsibility for the way things had played out, the way people had been hurt along the way. But this was different. Maxwell wasn't the one I had spent years with. He hadn't been the one to lie to me, to deceive me. He wasn't the one who had left me behind. He was simply the man who had moved in when I had been left out. Still, I felt something in me stir as I read the message again. It wasn't anger, not like I would have expected. It wasn't the fury I had been so accustomed to. It was a mix of something more complicated, something like curiosity. He owed me nothing, and yet he had reached out. He had taken the time to send a message when he could have easily chosen not to. I responded after a few moments of thought, a simple message, just a few words to keep the door open, just enough to acknowledge his attempt to make things right. I appreciate the apology. It means more than you know, I wrote, though I wasn't sure what it meant for me or where it would go from here. But I think we both know that things are different now. There's no going back. I didn't expect him to respond right away, and truthfully, I didn't know what I was hoping for. There was so much baggage between us, so much left unsaid. But when my phone buzzed with his reply a few hours later, I couldn't ignore it. I understand, the message began, but I feel like I owe you more than just words. I know I've been part of the reason for the damage, and I want to make up for it, in whatever way I can. The bluntness of his words hit me in a way I wasn't ready for. Make up for it? What did that even mean? Could anything really make up for the mess we had made? For the way our lives had spiraled out of control? I didn't know if there was any way to fix the past. I didn't know if anything could truly make things right. But as I read his message again, there was an honesty in it that I couldn't ignore. Maybe it was because I was tired of fighting. Maybe it was because I was tired of holding on to grudges that I had no power to change. Maybe it was because, for the first time, I was seeing him as a person, not just as the man who had taken my place in Isabella's life. The next few days were a blur of emotions, and I found myself thinking about Maxwell's apology more than I cared to admit. It didn't change the past. It didn't fix what had been broken between Isabella and me, but it did something else. It made me realize that I couldn't keep carrying this weight. I couldn't keep living in a world where I was angry, where I held everyone accountable for my unhappiness. I was tired of feeling bitter. I was tired of hating. I was tired of dragging the past with me everywhere I went. That's when I decided to reach out. Not just to Maxwell, but to myself. I sent him a final text, one that I knew would close the door on everything we had been through. It was time to let it go. I don't think there's much more to say, I typed, slowly. I'm moving forward. I need to let go of the past and focus on what's ahead. I knew it wasn't just about Maxwell. It was about me. It was about finally taking control of my life, letting go of the anger that had defined so much of my existence. I couldn't hold on to the things that had hurt me anymore. I couldn't stay in the past. And, to my surprise, Maxwell replied, "Understood, James. I'll always be grateful for your father, and I hope one day we can both move on. Take care of yourself." It was a simple response, but it was enough. For the first time, I felt a sense of peace, an understanding that the past was the past, and there was no point in dwelling on it. I had spent so long carrying around the weight of everything I had lost, but now, it was time to let it go. I wasn't the same person I had been before, and I wasn't the same person I had been when I was married to Isabella. I had learned to let go of my need for closure, to let go of my need for validation. It was time to move forward. And so, I did. The days following Maxwell's message felt like a new chapter in my life, one I hadn't expected to begin. His apology, though simple, had been the catalyst for something inside me to shift. I no longer felt the overwhelming bitterness that had clouded my thoughts for so long. It was as if something had clicked into place, and I could finally see that the path forward was mine to choose. But I didn't realize how much more change was waiting for me just around the corner. A few weeks after our brief conversation, I received an unexpected call from William, Maxwell's father. I had thought our interaction at the wedding would be the end of it, but apparently, I was wrong. When I saw his number pop up on my phone, I hesitated. I wasn't sure if I wanted to go back down that road of guilt, debts, and things better left behind. But something told me that this call was different. I answered. "James, I hope you're doing well," William said, his voice warm but strained. "I've been meaning to talk to you about something important." I shifted uncomfortably in my chair, unsure of what he was about to say. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. "I know it's been a while since we last spoke, and I want to say again how sorry I am for not reaching out sooner," he continued. "But there's something I need to tell you, something I think you should know." I leaned forward, a mix of curiosity and wariness bubbling up inside me. "What is it?" "Well, Maxwell and I have been talking a lot about what we can do to make things right, about how we can repay the debt your father's life-saving surgery created. And after some discussion, we've come up with something I hope you'll consider." I sat back, processing the weight of his words. Repay the debt? I had thought that William's gratitude was simply a matter of feeling indebted to my late father, but now it seemed like he was offering something more than I had expected. "James," William said, his voice more determined now, "we want to help you. We want to invest in your future." I blinked, unsure if I had heard him correctly. "Invest in my future?" I repeated. "What do you mean?" "Maxwell and I, well, our family. We've been in a position to offer significant financial backing to a few select businesses recently. And after learning more about your work and what you've been doing, we believe you have great potential," he explained. "We want to help fund your project, James. We want to invest in your career and give you the opportunity to grow in ways you haven't had the chance to before." I felt the words sink in slowly, each one carrying more weight than the last. I had never expected anything like this. Never expected Maxwell's family, who I had viewed as nothing more than the barrier between me and the life I once had, to offer me help. I wasn't sure how to respond. Was this real? Was I being offered a chance to take a step forward, to grow beyond the stagnant existence I had been living? A part of me wanted to refuse, to say that I didn't need their charity, that I didn't need to rely on someone else's generosity. But the other part of me, the one that had been too afraid to take risks, recognized an opportunity when it was laid before me. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my nerves. "I don't know what to say," I admitted. This is unexpected." "It's not charity, James," William reassured me. "It's an investment in your potential. You have more to offer than you realize. And we believe you can go far. But we can't do this without you. We need you to believe in yourself." The words hung in the air. I couldn't deny that part of me wanted to turn it down, to prove to myself that I didn't need anyone's help. But another part of me, the part that had spent so many years questioning my worth, realized how foolish that would be. This wasn't just about the money. This was about the opportunity to finally break free from the limitations I had placed on myself. This was a chance to prove that I could be more than the man I had been, more than the man who had always just gotten by. "I'll do it," I said, surprising myself with my own resolve. "I'll accept. But I need to be clear, this isn't about just the money. This is about me proving to myself that I can succeed. I'm not looking to live in anyone's shadow. I want to build something of my own." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, I wondered if I had said the wrong thing. But then William spoke, his voice filled with pride. "I believe in you, James," he said quietly, "and I think this is the right step for you. We'll make it happen. We'll help you get where you want to go." For the first time in a long time, I felt like something had shifted. It wasn't just the promise of financial backing. It wasn't just the chance to prove myself. It was the realization that I wasn't alone anymore. I wasn't stuck in this cycle of feeling small, of feeling invisible. For the first time, I had an opportunity to step into a world where my potential was recognized, where my efforts would finally matter. We talked for a while longer about the specifics, about how the funding would work, about the plans for the future. I hung up the phone with a sense of determination settling in my chest. This was it. This was my chance to turn everything around. I didn't have to live in the shadow of my past anymore. I had the power to shape my own future. And with that realization, something inside me clicked. The years of doubt, the years of feeling like I wasn't good enough, all started to fade. I wasn't just a man broken by his past anymore. I was a man with a future that was mine to create. I would take this opportunity. I would make the most of it. And no matter what happened, I would prove that I was worth this chance. As I sat back in my chair after hanging up with William, the weight of the conversation hit me in waves. I could feel the pulse of something shifting inside me, something I had almost forgotten existed. Possibility. It had been so long since I allowed myself to believe in it. But now, with this unexpected offer, everything seemed different. The landscape of my life was changing, and I wasn't sure I was ready for it. I had spent so much time resenting my failures, so much time looking back at what I didn't have, that I hadn't even noticed how much potential I had been sitting on. Maxwell's family offering me this chance wasn't just about their generosity. It was a reminder that I had worth, that I had something to offer. It wasn't about the money. It was about the opportunity to break free from my own limitations, to step out of the shadows of my past. I wasn't sure what would happen next, but I knew I had to take this seriously. I couldn't squander this chance. I owed it to myself to at least try. I spent the next few days in a whirlwind of thoughts and decisions. I had a lot to think about, things I hadn't even considered before. This wasn't just about accepting a handout. This was about aligning myself with something bigger, something that had the potential to change the course of my life. I needed to have a plan, a strategy. I couldn't just take the money and assume everything would fall into place. The idea of business and management had always intrigued me, but I had never given myself the chance to dive in headfirst. I had always played it safe, stuck to my day job, keeping things comfortable and predictable. But I wasn't that person anymore. I couldn't afford to be. I began to research, poring over books and articles, taking notes on everything that could help me develop the skills I needed to succeed. Maxwell's family wasn't offering me a handout. They were offering me a partnership. A partnership meant trust. It meant responsibility. I had to prove that I was capable, that I could handle the weight of this opportunity. By the end of the week, I had created a detailed plan for the future, a roadmap of how I intended to use the financial backing I was being offered. I had to start small, build a foundation that would allow me to expand. I focused on what I knew best, the areas I had experience in, and began laying the groundwork for my own business venture. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be quick, but it was going to be mine. That night, after I had completed my initial plans, I sat down in my apartment, looking over the papers I had written. The apartment felt different now, less like a place to hide from my past, and more like a space to build something new. My surroundings had changed, and with that, so had I. There was no more holding on to the mistakes and regrets of the past. I had a chance to write my own story, and I wasn't going to let it slip through my fingers. But as I worked through the night, I couldn't help but think about Isabella. It had been months since we last spoke. I hadn't heard from her at all since the wedding, and honestly, I didn't expect to. I didn't need her approval, didn't need any validation from her. But there was still a part of me, no matter how much I tried to suppress it, that wondered what she thought about all this. What would she say if she knew? I shook my head, trying to clear the thoughts from my mind. Isabella was a part of my past. She had made her choices, and I had made mine. I had spent so much of my life trying to keep up with her expectations, trying to be someone I wasn't for her. But now, I was doing this for myself. I was building something real, something that had nothing to do with her, nothing to do with Maxwell, and everything to do with who I was becoming. The next morning, I sent William an email, outlining my plans and what I hoped to achieve with his family's support. I wanted to show him that I wasn't just some guy who had been handed an opportunity. I was someone who could take that opportunity and turn it into something meaningful. It was time to prove to myself that I was capable. Days turned into weeks, and the reality of what I was doing began to settle in. There were moments of doubt, of course. I found myself questioning whether I was truly ready for what I had taken on. Was I capable of running my own business? Was I good enough to prove that I deserved the chance I had been given? But I couldn't allow those doubts to hold me back. Every morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose that I hadn't felt in years. I worked tirelessly, reaching out to potential clients, refining my plans, and building the foundation of the business. And slowly but surely, things began to take shape. I wasn't where I wanted to be yet, but I was closer than I had ever been. One day, while sitting in my office, reviewing contracts and planning my next steps, my phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was from William. "James," he said, his voice warm and encouraging. "I've been following your progress, and I have to say, I'm impressed. You've done a great job with the groundwork. We're all on board. Let's move forward." His words hit me harder than I expected. It was one thing to get an offer, to be given a chance, but it was another thing entirely to have someone believe in you, to have someone say that they saw potential in you, that they trusted you to take the next step. It was a validation I had been missing for so long. "You won't regret this," I said, my voice filled with newfound confidence. I meant it. I wasn't going to let this opportunity slip away. As I ended the call, I sat back in my chair, looking out the window at the city below. The future, which had always seemed so uncertain, was now filled with possibilities. I wasn't stuck anymore. I wasn't the same man I had been a year ago, the one who had spent his days drifting through life. I was someone new, someone who had the strength to build, to grow, to prove that I was worth everything that had been handed to me. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't just moving forward for the sake of it. I was moving forward for me. I still remember the way her words cut through me like a blade, sharp and deliberate. Vanessa stood at the top of the grand staircase of our mansion, her expression cold and unyielding as she delivered her final blow. "Thanks for the $3 million inheritance, darling," she said, her lips curling into a smug smile. "I needed it to build my startup. Now get out. My new boyfriend needs space." Her voice was as calm as if she were discussing the weather, but every word landed with the force of a hammer. I stood there, frozen, my suitcase already half-packed, the echoes of her laughter bouncing off the marble walls. For a moment, I wondered if she had always been this cruel, or if I had simply been too blind to see it. This was the woman I had loved, trusted, and supported through everything. I had given her my time, my resources, my heart, and in return, she had stabbed me in the back with a smile on her face. I didn't say anything. What could I say? Words felt useless in the face of her betrayal. So, I nodded, my outward calm masking the storm brewing inside me. "All right, Vanessa," I said quietly, "if that's what you want." She seemed almost disappointed by my lack of reaction, her smug expression faltering for just a moment before she regained her composure. "It's what's best for both of us," she said, as if she were doing me a favor. I finished packing my bags, each movement deliberate and controlled. I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of seeing me break. As I zipped up the suitcase and glanced around the room one last time, I felt a strange sense of detachment. This house, this life we had built together, it wasn't mine anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. Vanessa followed me to the front door, her arms crossed and her expression impatient. "Lucas will be here soon," she said, referring to her new boyfriend. Don't make this any harder than it has to be. I turned to face her, studying her face for any trace of regret or guilt. There was none, just arrogance and entitlement. Good luck, Vanessa, I said simply, my voice steady. I hope your startup is everything you dreamed it would be. Her laughter followed me as I stepped out into the crisp evening air, the suitcase rolling behind me. I didn't look back. The drive to the hotel was quiet, the silence broken only by the faint hum of the engine. I replayed the events of the evening in my mind, each word and action etched into my memory. The betrayal was staggering, but there was something else beneath the pain, something that felt a lot like resolve. Vanessa thought she had one. She thought she had outsmarted me, taken everything, and left me with nothing. But what she didn't know was that her perfect plan was built on a foundation of lies, and I had spent months preparing for this moment. As I checked into the small, modest hotel and settled into the room, I allowed myself a moment to breathe. The room was simple, a stark contrast to the opulence of the mansion I had just left, but it felt oddly comforting. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring out the window at the city lights, and let the storm inside me simmer. Vanessa had underestimated me, but she was about to learn just how wrong she was. This wasn't the end of my story. It was only the beginning. The hotel room was quiet, its walls bare and impersonal. A single bedside lamp cast a soft glow across the modest space, and the muffled hum of city traffic outside was the only sound breaking the silence. I sat on the edge of the bed, my suitcase untouched in the corner, staring at nothing in particular. This was my reality now, a far cry from the sprawling mansion I had once called home. I should have felt devastated, but what I felt was something heavier, colder. Betrayal is a strange thing. It doesn't hit you all at once. It comes in waves, each one bringing a fresh sting as you replay every memory, every moment that now feels like a lie. I thought about Vanessa's smile, the way she used to laugh at my jokes, the nights we spent dreaming about the future. Had any of it been real? Or had I just been too blind to see what was right in front of me? I leaned back against the headboard, staring at the ceiling. The $3 million inheritance. I had received it from my late father, a man who had built an empire through sheer determination and hard work. He had always taught me to value loyalty, to never take trust for granted. And here I was, watching everything he had left me being used as a stepping stone by the woman I once trusted most. I closed my eyes, the memory of Vanessa's smug laugh replaying in my mind. "Thanks for the $3 million inheritance, darling," she had said. I needed it to build my startup. I had believed in her dreams once, supported her when no one else did. I had sacrificed time, money, and even parts of myself to see her succeed. But now, as I sat in that hotel room, it was clear that my sacrifices had been nothing more than convenient stepping stones for her ambitions. The betrayal wasn't just about the money. It was about the lies, the manipulation, the complete lack of respect. She had thrown me out like I was nothing, confident in her belief that she had outsmarted me, that I would fade into obscurity while she thrived. But what Vanessa didn't know, what she never cared to notice, was that I wasn't the fool she thought I was. I had seen the cracks in her facade long before she made her move. The late nights at the office that didn't add up, the sudden coldness in her tone, the way she dismissed me as if I were an inconvenience. For months, I had been piecing together the puzzle, quietly preparing for the day she would finally reveal her true colors. And now, that day had come. I pulled my laptop from my bag and opened it on the small desk in the corner of the room. Logging into my accounts, I reviewed everything I had set in motion months ago. The inheritance, the joint accounts, even the shares I had quietly acquired in her startup, all of it was secure. She had no idea that the foundation of her so-called victory was already crumbling beneath her feet. As I scrolled through the details, a sense of clarity settled over me. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming what was mine. Vanessa had built her empire on my trust, my sacrifices, and my inheritance. Now, I was going to show her what it felt like to lose everything. But revenge wasn't the only thing driving me. Sitting there in that room, I realized that I had been holding onto something far more destructive than betrayal. The belief that love could survive without respect and loyalty. Love, I had learned, is not enough. It's not enough to build a life on, not enough to sustain a marriage, not enough to excuse the kind of pain Vanessa had caused. For years, I had clung to the idea of who she was, ignoring the warning signs, convincing myself that things would get better. But the truth was, Vanessa hadn't just betrayed me. She had been betraying me for a long time. I had just refused to see it. Now, as I sat in that small hotel room, the weight of those years pressing down on me, I made a promise to myself. I would take back what was mine, not just the money or the mansion, but my dignity, my confidence, my life. Vanessa thought she had one. She thought she had taken everything and left me with nothing. But she was about to learn the truth. This wasn't the end of my story. It was a turning point. I closed the laptop and leaned back in the chair, a faint smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. The betrayal still stung, but it wasn't the defining moment Vanessa believed it to be. No, the defining moment would come later, when she realized just how badly she had underestimated me. The next morning, I woke up to the faint sounds of the city outside my hotel window. For a brief moment, I forgot where I was. The small, cramped room was a far cry from the luxurious surroundings I'd grown accustomed to. But as the events of the previous day came flooding back, I felt an unexpected sense of purpose. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something new. I brewed the complimentary coffee from the hotel's mediocre machine and sat at the small desk with my laptop. It was time to act. Months ago, I had started making quiet preparations when Vanessa's behavior first set off alarms in my mind. Her late-night calls, her dismissive attitude, the way she'd downplay my questions about her growing business trips, it all added up. I wasn't a fool, though she thought I was. While she plotted her betrayal, I was setting safeguards in place. Now, it was time to put those plans into motion. The first call I made was to Ethan, my lawyer. Ethan wasn't just a lawyer. He was a strategist, a man who thrived on untangling complicated webs and turning them into his client's advantage. He picked up on the second ring, his voice sharp and alert. "Oliver," he greeted, his tone measured. "I've been expecting your call. Has she made her move?" "She has," I replied, my voice steady. "She kicked me out yesterday. Took the house, gloated about the inheritance. She thinks she's won." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Ethan spoke again, a hint of amusement in his voice. "She doesn't know, does she?" "No," I said. "She has no idea." We spent the next hour going over every detail of the plan we had put in place months earlier. The inheritance Vanessa believed she had complete control over, it was secured in a trust under my name. The joint accounts she thought were hers to spend freely, frozen. The shares in her startup that she assumed belonged entirely to her, reallocated to a trust one controlled. Ethan's voice was calm and confident as he walked me through the next steps. "Everything is airtight," he assured me. "She won't see it coming. But we'll play this carefully. Let her think she's in control for a little longer. The more reckless she becomes, the easier it will be to expose her." After hanging up, I felt a sense of relief. For the first time in days, the storm in my chest began to settle. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't at her mercy. The second call I made was to my financial advisor, Daniel. Daniel had been instrumental in setting up the trust and securing my assets. He was meticulous and methodical, exactly the kind of person you wanted in your corner when dealing with someone like Vanessa. "Oliver," Daniel said when he answered, "I assume this is about the trust?" "Exactly," I replied. "Everything's still in place?" "Every penny," he confirmed. "She won't be able to touch a dime. And the shares in her startup, those are still tied to the trust. She may think she owns the company outright, but legally, you have significant control." The thought brought a faint smile to my face. Vanessa's startup, the business she had built on my money and resources, wasn't as untouchable as she believed. "Good," I said. "Let's keep it that way." After the calls, I sat back in the chair, letting the gravity of my preparations sink in. Vanessa had spent months, maybe years, plotting her betrayal, carefully crafting the illusion of control. But she hadn't counted on me being one step ahead. Still, this wasn't just about taking back what was mine. It was about making her face the consequences of her actions. Vanessa's arrogance had blinded her to the reality of the situation, and I was more than willing to let her walk further into the trap she had set for herself. Over the next few days, I stayed in the hotel, working quietly and methodically. I monitored her moves from a distance, watching as she flaunted her victory on social media, lavish parties, expensive purchases, gloating captions about her newfound freedom. Each post was a reminder of her overconfidence, her belief that she had outsmarted me. But what she didn't realize was that every move she made only tightened the noose. The reckoning would come. Not yet, but soon. One evening, as I sat by the window watching the city lights flicker in the distance, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Control. For years, Vanessa had dominated our relationship, her manipulations and insults chipping away at my confidence. But now, the tables had turned. She thought she had won, but the game was far from over. I closed my laptop and leaned back, a small smile playing on my lips. Let her celebrate. Let her think she's in control. Because when the time came, she wouldn't just lose the game. She'd realize she never stood a chance. Vanessa had always been a performer. She thrived on attention, relished in the admiration of others, and basked in the glow of validation. It was no surprise, then, that her first move after throwing me out was to flaunt her supposed triumph to the world. Within days of my departure, she hosted a party at the mansion. I saw it on social media, of course. Vanessa made sure to document every moment. Her account was flooded with photos of her surrounded by friends, holding a glass of champagne in one hand and draping the other over her new boyfriend, Lucas. "Here's to new beginnings," the caption read, accompanied by a string of emojis. I stared at the screen, shaking my head. It was almost laughable how predictable she was. Vanessa's need to show off her perceived victory blinded her to the reality of her situation. She believed she had everything under control, that I was out of the picture, and that the wealth and lifestyle she had stolen from me were hers to enjoy. But I wasn't angry as I scrolled through the images of her celebration. No, anger had given way to something much sharper: determination. Vanessa thought the mansion was hers. She thought the startup was hers. She thought her position of power was secure. She had no idea that the foundation of her success was already crumbling beneath her feet. The party was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, Vanessa threw herself into the role of a successful entrepreneur and socialite. She attended galas, hosted networking events, and made grand proclamations about the future of her startup. I followed her every move from a distance, watching as she spent money she didn't realize she no longer had. Lavish vacations, designer clothes, expensive dinners, all financed by accounts that were frozen or assets that were no longer hers. Lucas, her new boyfriend, seemed to be enjoying the ride. He appeared in every photo, always by her side, grinning like the cat that got the cream. I wondered if he knew the truth, if he realized that the lifestyle he was basking in was built on borrowed time. But Lucas wasn't my concern. Vanessa was. Her arrogance made her reckless. She had convinced herself that I was irrelevant, that I was licking my wounds somewhere while she danced on the grave of our marriage. And in her overconfidence, she made mistake after mistake. The first was her decision to expand the startup. She announced a new product line with a press release that boasted about the company's unprecedented growth. Investors were invited to a launch event, complete with expensive catering, custom decorations, and even a live performance by a well-known musician. The event was a spectacle, the kind Vanessa lived for. Photos of her on stage, microphone in hand, flooded my feed the next morning. She looked radiant, confident, invincible. But what Vanessa didn't realize was that her grand launch was funded by a business she didn't fully control. The trust one had established months ago held a significant portion of her company's shares. Legally, she couldn't make major financial decisions without my approval. Not that she had bothered to check. Her second mistake was doubling down on her lavish lifestyle. She replaced her car with an even more expensive model, renovated parts of the mansion, and booked a month-long trip to Europe with Lucas. Each move was a declaration of her supposed independence, a way to show the world, and me, that she didn't need anyone. But each move also brought her closer to the edge of the cliff. From my small hotel room, I watched it all unfold. I forwarded the information to Ethan, who who confirmed that her reckless spending and unauthorized business decisions would only strengthen our position when the time came to act. "She's digging her own grave," Ethan said during one of our calls. "And the deeper she digs, the harder it'll be for her to climb out." I nodded, feeling a grim sense of satisfaction. Vanessa's overconfidence was her greatest weakness, and she was playing right into my hands. Still, I waited. Timing was everything, and I wanted her to fall as far as possible before I pulled the rug out from under her. The higher she climbed, the harder the fall. One evening, as I scrolled through the latest photos from her European trip, I couldn't help but laugh. There she was, posing in front of the Eiffel Tower with Lucas, champagne in hand, her caption reading, "Living my best life." She thought she had one. She thought she was untouchable. But the truth was, Vanessa's perfect world was already cracking at the seams. And soon, those cracks would become impossible to ignore. Vanessa's downfall began with a single phone call. It was a Friday morning when the cracks in her perfect world started to show. She must have been in the middle of another extravagant shopping spree, swiping her platinum card with the confidence of someone who believed they could never run out of money. When the transaction was declined, she likely chalked it up to a minor glitch. She would have smiled at the cashier, confident as ever, and tried again. But the second decline must have caught her off guard. By the third, I imagined the panic starting to creep in. That's when she called the bank. I wasn't there to hear the conversation, but I could picture it perfectly. Vanessa's calm, confident tone giving way to irritation as she demanded answers, only to be told something she hadn't anticipated. The accounts were frozen. The money she thought was hers to burn had been secured months ago, locked away in the trust one had established. She couldn't touch a single penny without my authorization. The first call from her came to my phone shortly after. I watched it ring, her name flashing across the screen, and for a moment, I considered answering. But I decided against it. Let her sit with the confusion a little longer. Over the next few hours, the calls became more frequent. I let them all go to voicemail, each one more frantic than the last. "Oliver, call me back. There's something wrong with the accounts." "This isn't funny, Oliver. I need to talk to you. Pick up the phone. I need to know what's going on." By the end of the day, her messages took on a new tone, desperation. "Please, Oliver. I don't know what's happening. Just please call me back." I didn't. That evening, I called Ethan instead. "She's starting to feel it," I said, unable to hide the satisfaction in my voice. Ethan chuckled. "Good. Let her stew. The financial pressure is just the beginning. Once she realizes how deeply everything is tied to the trust, she'll start making mistakes." He was right. The next day, Vanessa attempted to access the startup's funds to cover her growing expenses. But like her personal accounts, those funds were also tied to the trust. Every transaction required my approval, a detail she had either forgotten or chosen to ignore. Her frustration must have reached its peak when the company's financial advisor informed her that she couldn't authorize payments without my signature. That's when Lucas entered the picture. Vanessa had paraded him around as her perfect new partner, a younger, charming man who basked in the wealth she provided. But as her financial troubles mounted, Lucas's charm began to fade. I heard about their first fight through a mutual acquaintance who had attended one of Vanessa's parties. Lucas had confronted her in front of several guests, demanding to know why her card had been declined at a luxury boutique earlier that day. Vanessa, ever the performer, had tried to laugh it off, claiming it was a misunderstanding. But Lucas wasn't convinced. "You promised me this life," he had reportedly said. "If you can't keep up, what am I even doing here?" It was the beginning of the end for their relationship. Vanessa's panic grew with each passing day. Her once lavish lifestyle was now slipping through her fingers, and she had no idea how to stop it. The breaking point came when she tried to sell shares in the startup to cover her mounting expenses, only to be informed that the shares were part of the trust. She couldn't sell what she didn't fully own. I received another flurry of calls that evening, her voice shrill and panicked in the voicemail she left. "Oliver, you need to call me back. What have you done? I can't access anything. This isn't fair. You can't do this to me. You're ruining everything." I sat in my hotel room, listening to each voicemail with a calm, detached expression. This was the moment I had been waiting for. The moment Vanessa realized that her empire was built on sand. The next day, I received a call from Ethan. "She's contacted her lawyer," he said. "It sounds like she's trying to challenge the trust." I couldn't help but laugh. "Let her try. She won't get far." Ethan agreed. "Everything is airtight. She doesn't have a leg to stand on." By the end of the week, Vanessa's perfect world had begun to crumble. Her accounts were frozen, her company was tied up in legal red tape, and Lucas, her golden ticket to a new life, was starting to distance himself. It was only a matter of time before the media caught wind of the chaos. As I sat on the balcony of my hotel that evening, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. Vanessa had underestimated me, dismissed me as a fool. But now, she was learning the hard way that I wasn't the man she thought I was. Her financial bombshell was only the beginning. Vanessa's world, already teetering on the edge, began to collapse in spectacular fashion. It started quietly enough. A murmur here, a whispered conversation there. But it wasn't long before the whispers turned into headlines. I didn't have to orchestrate much for this phase of my plan. Vanessa's overconfidence and recklessness had done most of the work for me. Ethan, ever the strategist, had sent a carefully crafted report to a few key stakeholders in her company. The document highlighted discrepancies in the startup's financial records, pointing out irregularities that would make even the most forgiving investor think twice. It didn't take long for the media to get their hands on the story. Entrepreneur Vanessa Grant faces allegations of financial mismanagement. The headline splashed across my screen the next morning, accompanied by a photo of Vanessa at one of her lavish parties. She was mid-laugh, champagne flute in hand, looking every bit the confident businesswoman. The irony wasn't lost on me. I scrolled through the article, which detailed how investors were pulling out and raising concerns about her ability to manage the company's finances. The reporter had done their homework, citing specific instances where funds had been allocated to personal expenses rather than business development. By the end of the article, it was clear. Vanessa's reputation as a savvy entrepreneur was in shambles. I leaned back in my chair, sipping my coffee as I imagined her reaction to the news. She had spent so much time cultivating an image of success, of being untouchable. To see it all unravel in the public, I must have been devastating. The fallout was swift. Investors began withdrawing their support, leaving Vanessa scrambling to hold the company together. She called emergency meetings, pleading with her stakeholders to give her more time, but the damage was already done. The trust she had so carefully cultivated was gone, replaced by doubt and suspicion. Lucas, of course, was nowhere to be found. The first sign of his departure came when he quietly unfollowed her on social media. The man who had been glued to her side at every party, every event, was suddenly absent. Mutual acquaintances told me he had moved out of the mansion, leaving behind little more than a terse note. "I didn't sign up for this," it reportedly read. Vanessa's desperation reached new heights. She tried to go on the offensive, contacting journalists to spin the story in her favor. She claimed the allegations were baseless, a coordinated attack by jealous competitors. But her efforts only made things worse. The more she tried to fight back, the more the media scrutinized her actions. They dug into her past, unearthing every questionable decision she had ever made. The picture they painted was not a flattering one. Vanessa Grant, a businesswoman's rise and fall. Another headline, another nail in the coffin. I followed it all from the comfort of my hotel room. Each new development a reminder of just how far she had fallen. Her social media presence, once a constant stream of curated perfection, grew quieter by the day. The photos of lavish parties and luxury vacations were replaced by vague, apologetic posts that garnered more criticism than sympathy. But the real tipping point came when the mansion, her crown jewel, became a point of contention. The property, purchased through the trust one had established, was never truly hers. And now, with her accounts frozen and her company on the brink of collapse, she could no longer afford to maintain it. The eviction notice came swiftly, delivered to her door one sunny afternoon. She must have been in shock as she read it, realizing that the home she had flaunted as a symbol of her success was slipping through her fingers. I received a message from Ethan later that day. She's contacted her lawyer again, he said, his tone calm. They're trying to contest the ownership of the mansion. Let them try, I replied. They won't get anywhere. He chuckled. No, they won't. But it's interesting. Her desperation is showing. She's out of options. By the end of the week, Vanessa's public downfall was complete. The media had turned against her, investors had pulled out, and Lucas had vanished without a trace. The woman who had once stood at the top of her self-made empire was now facing the harsh reality of her choices. That evening, as I sat on the balcony of my hotel, I reflected on everything that had happened. Vanessa's arrogance had been her undoing, her need to dominate and control ultimately leading to her downfall. But this wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice. She had taken everything from me, my trust, my resources, my sense of stability, and used it to build a life that was as hollow as her promises. Now, she was facing the consequences of her actions, and I didn't feel an ounce of guilt. Vanessa had always been a performer, but the curtain had finally fallen, and the show was over. The day of the showdown arrived with an air of inevitability. It was a crisp morning when I received a message from Vanessa. It wasn't the frantic, desperate tone she had taken in her previous voicemails. No, this message was calculated, her attempt to regain control. Oliver, we need to talk. Come to the mansion this evening. Let's sort this out like adults. I read the text twice, a faint smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. It was a bold move, inviting me back to the very house she had smugly thrown me out of not long ago. I could almost hear her rehearsing her words, planning how she would manipulate the situation to her advantage. She wanted to intimidate me, to make me feel small in the shadow of the life she had stolen. But what Vanessa didn't know was that the mansion she clung to so desperately wasn't hers to claim. I arrived just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the warm glow of the setting sun casting long shadows over the grand estate. The driveway was empty, no luxury cars, no sign of her entourage of sycophants. It seemed Lucas had truly abandoned her. Vanessa opened the door before I could knock. She was dressed to impress, her makeup meticulously applied, and her jewelry sparkling under the chandelier in the foyer. She was playing the role of the confident hostess, but I could see the cracks in her facade, the tension in her jaw, the slight tremble in her hand as she gestured for me to enter. Oliver, she greeted, forcing a smile. I'm glad you came. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing against the marble floors. The mansion, once filled with the noise of her endless parties, felt hollow and lifeless. The opulence of the space only emphasized the emptiness within it. What's this about, Vanessa? I asked, my tone calm but firm. She motioned for me to sit in the living room, where a bottle of expensive wine sat on the coffee table, 2 glasses already poured. I remained standing. I thought it was time we cleared the air, she said, settling into one of the plush armchairs. Things have gotten out of hand, and I think we both want the same thing, to move forward. I raised an eyebrow, crossing my arms. Move forward? After everything you've done? She sighed dramatically, as if she were the victim in this scenario. Look, I know things didn't end well between us, but we're both adults, and there's no reason we can't come to an agreement. I'm willing to. Cut the act, Vanessa, I interrupted, my voice sharp. You didn't invite me here to make amends. You're desperate, and this is your last-ditch effort to regain control. So let's skip the pretense and get to the point. Her composure faltered, and for a moment, I saw the anger flash in her eyes. She quickly masked it with another forced smile. Fine, she said, leaning forward. You want the truth? I need your help. The company is falling apart, the mansion is at risk, and the media won't stop hounding me. If you could just, she trailed off, her voice softening as she tried to summon a shred of sincerity. Help me stabilize things. We could both come out of this better off. I couldn't help but laugh, a short, humorless sound that echoed through the room. Vanessa, you still don't get it, do you? I said, shaking my head. You're not in control anymore. The mansion you're so desperate to save? It's not yours. It never was. Her eyes narrowed. What are you talking about? I reached into my bag and pulled out the trust documents, placing them on the table between us. The mansion was purchased through the trust one set up. Legally, it belongs to me. And as of this morning, I've started the process of reclaiming it. The color drained from her face as she scanned the papers, her hands trembling. You can't do this, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I already have, I replied, my tone cold. You spent months building your empire on my inheritance, my trust, and my support. You thought you could take everything and leave me with nothing. But you were wrong. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and fear. You're doing this out of spite, she spat. You're trying to ruin me. No, Vanessa, I said, standing and looking down at her. You ruined yourself. I'm just taking back what was mine. I turned and walked toward the door, her protests ringing out behind me. You can't just leave me like this. You owe me. I stopped in the doorway, glancing back at her one last time. I don't owe you anything, I said. Goodbye, Vanessa. The slam of the door echoed through the mansion as I stepped out into the cool night air. I felt no guilt, no regret. Only the satisfaction of knowing that the life she had stolen was slipping through her fingers. Vanessa had played her games, but the mansion showdown marked the end of her reign. And as I drove away, I couldn't help but smile. Vanessa's fall from grace wasn't just a series of unfortunate events. It was a symphony of consequences, each one striking a chord of poetic justice. The mansion was just the beginning. With nowhere to hide and no resources left to exploit, her carefully constructed facade began to crumble faster than even I had anticipated. The first blow came when the lawsuits started piling up. Investors who had once fawned over her charisma and visionary leadership were now demanding answers and their money. Ethan had predicted this would happen, and he was right. The financial discrepancies in her startup weren't just embarrassing. They were borderline criminal. Misallocated funds, falsified expense reports, and lavish personal expenditures disguised as business development left her with a mountain of legal troubles. I heard about the first lawsuit through Ethan, who called me one afternoon with a note of amusement in his voice. Vanessa's being sued by two of her largest investors, he said, and they're not holding back. They're going after her personally, not just the company. She must be panicking, I replied, picturing her sitting in a lawyer's office, frantically trying to explain away the mess she'd created. Panic doesn't even begin to cover it, Ethan said. She's drowning, Oliver. And the more she fights, the worse it's going to get. The lawsuits weren't the only problem she faced. The media, having already exposed her financial mismanagement, began digging deeper into her past. Old business associates came forward with stories of betrayal and deceit, painting a picture of a woman who had built her career on manipulation and shortcuts. *** Vanessa Grant. From rising star to corporate pariah ***. That headline made the rounds across every major outlet, accompanied by an unflattering photo of her leaving a courthouse, looking frazzled and unkempt. The woman who once thrived on attention was now the subject of public scorn, her name synonymous with greed and failure. But the most significant blow came from within her own company. The employees she had once treated as expendable began to turn against her, leaking internal emails and documents that further exposed her misconduct. The board of directors, desperate to salvage what was left of the startup, voted to remove her as CEO. When the news broke, I couldn't help but feel a grim sense of satisfaction. Vanessa had always believed she was invincible, untouchable. But now, she was learning the hard way that actions have consequences. The fallout wasn't limited to her professional life. Her personal life was in shambles, too. Lucas, the man she had chosen over me, had vanished without a trace. Friends who once clamored for her attention now avoided her calls. Even her family, who had always turned a blind eye to her flaws, distanced themselves to avoid being dragged into the chaos. Vanessa was truly alone. I wasn't entirely surprised when she tried to reach out to me again. The first message was a carefully worded email, dripping with forced humility. Oliver, I know I've made mistakes. I was hoping we could talk. Please, for old time's sake, can we meet? I deleted it without replying. The second attempt came a few days later, a phone call that I let go to voicemail. Her voice was shaky, a far cry from the confident woman who had once laughed in my face as she threw me out of the mansion. Oliver, I don't know what to do. Everything's falling apart. I need your help. Please, just call me back. I didn't. Ethan advised me to stay out of it entirely, and I agreed. Vanessa had made her choices, and now she was facing the consequences of those choices. There was nothing more to say. Still, I couldn't deny the bittersweet nature of her downfall. This was a woman I had once loved, someone I had built a life with. But the Vanessa I had fallen for no longer existed, if she ever truly had. One final blow came when the courts ruled against her in the lawsuits. She was ordered to repay millions to her investors, money she didn't have. Her accounts were empty, her assets seized, and her company dissolved. The mansion was gone, the startup was gone, and her reputation was in tatters. Vanessa Grant, the self-proclaimed powerhouse entrepreneur, had been reduced to nothing. That evening, as I sat on the balcony of my penthouse, overlooking the city that had once felt like a prison, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. Vanessa's reckoning wasn't just about justice. It was a turning point for me as well. For years, I had allowed her to control the narrative, to dictate the terms of our relationship and my life. But now, I was free. Free from her manipulation, her cruelty, and her arrogance. The reckoning wasn't just hers, it was mine too. As the city lights twinkled below, I raised a glass to the future. A future that no longer included Vanessa, but one that was filled with possibility. The days following Vanessa's downfall felt surreal, like a storm had finally passed, leaving a calm, open sky. For years, I had been caught in her web, tangled in the lies, manipulations, and emotional warfare that had defined our relationship. But now, for the first time, I was free to rebuild my life on my terms. I started small. The penthouse, which had once felt like an escape from the chaos of our marriage, began to feel like home. I spent my mornings standing on the balcony, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise over the city. The quiet moments of solitude reminded me of the man I had been before Vanessa came into my life. A man who valued simplicity, honesty, and peace. But this new chapter wasn't just about reclaiming who I was. It was about moving forward. The first step was diving back into work. For years, I had put my career on the back burner, funneling time, money, and energy into Vanessa's startup. Now, with her influence no longer weighing me down, I could focus on projects that truly mattered to me. I partnered with Ethan, who introduced me to a few like-minded investors. Together, we launched a venture capital firm aimed at supporting small businesses and entrepreneurs with a vision for sustainability and social impact. It wasn't just about making money. It was about building something meaningful, something that reflected my values. The work was invigorating. Every deal, every meeting, every handshake felt like a step toward the future I wanted to create. And for the first time in a long time, I felt proud of what I was doing. But the rebuilding process wasn't limited to my professional life. I also began reconnecting with old friends, people I had drifted away from during my marriage to Vanessa. They welcomed me back with open arms, their support a reminder that I hadn't lost everything. One evening, I hosted a dinner party at the penthouse. It was a small gathering, just a handful of close friends and colleagues. The laughter, the conversations, the clinking of glasses, it all felt so natural, so genuine. "You look happy," one of my oldest friends said as we stood on the balcony later that night, the city lights twinkling below. "I am," I replied, and I meant it. There were other changes, too. I took up painting again, something I hadn't done since my 20s. It started as a way to pass the time, but it quickly became a passion. My studio in the penthouse soon filled with canvases, landscapes, abstract pieces, and even a few portraits. Each brushstroke felt like a form of therapy, a way to process everything I had been through. The betrayal, the anger, the pain. It all found its way onto the canvas, transformed into something beautiful. As the months went by, I began to feel like a different person, or maybe just a better version of myself. The weight of the past no longer hung over me. Vanessa's name was barely a whisper in my thoughts, a ghost from a life I no longer lived. But the real turning point came when I received an email from one of the small businesses our firm had invested in. "Thank you for believing in us," it read. "Your support has changed everything for us. We're finally able to expand and hire more staff. We couldn't have done this without you." Reading those words brought a lump to my throat. For years, I had poured my resources into Vanessa's dreams, only to be met with betrayal. But now, I was helping people who truly appreciated it, people who were using that support to create something meaningful. It was a reminder that even the darkest chapters of our lives can lead to brighter days. One afternoon, I stood on the balcony, looking out over the city, and thought about how far I had come. The man I was when Vanessa threw me out of the mansion felt like a distant memory. I had been lost, broken, and unsure of who I was. But now, I was stronger. Vanessa's betrayal had been painful, yes, but it had also been a catalyst, a wake-up call that forced me to reevaluate everything. And in the process, I had discovered a version of myself I didn't even know existed. The man standing on that balcony wasn't just surviving. He was thriving. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in shades of gold and amber, I raised a glass to the future. This was my life now, full of purpose, passion, and peace. And I wasn't going to let anything, or anyone, take that away from me again. The knock on my door came on a rainy evening, the kind where the city seemed to slow down under the weight of the storm. I wasn't expecting anyone, which made the intrusion all the more surprising. When I opened the door, there she was, Vanessa. She was drenched, her once meticulous appearance now disheveled. Her makeup had smudged from the rain, and her hair clung to her face in damp strands. For a moment, I didn't recognize her. The woman standing before me wasn't the confident, calculating Vanessa who had once ruled over my life. She looked broken. "Oliver," she said, her voice trembling, "I need to talk to you." I stood in the doorway, letting her words hang in the air. Part of me wanted to slam the door in her face, to remind her of the humiliation she had inflicted on me. But another part of me, a quieter, calmer part, wanted to hear what she had to say. "What do you want, Vanessa?" I asked, my tone even. Her shoulders sagged, and she looked down at her hands, which were clutching the strap of her rain-soaked handbag. I don't know where else to go," she admitted. "I've lost everything, Oliver. The mansion, the company, the money. It's all gone." Her voice cracked on the last word, and for a fleeting moment, I felt a pang of pity. But it was quickly overshadowed by the memory of her smug smile, her cold words as she threw me out of the house we had once shared. "That's not my problem," I said, stepping back slightly. Her eyes shot up, desperation etched into her face. "Please," she whispered. "I know I hurt you. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I don't have anyone else. Lucas left me, my friends won't return my calls, and my family, they don't want anything to do with me." She paused, wiping a tear from her cheek. "I've hit rock bottom, Oliver, and I'm so sorry for everything I did to you. I was selfish, arrogant, and blind. I didn't see what I had until it was gone." I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. "And now you want me to save you?" She flinched at the bluntness of my words, but she didn't deny it. Instead, she nodded, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I don't know what else to do," I sighed, stepping aside to let her into the penthouse. She hesitated for a moment before walking in, her shoes leaving wet marks on the pristine floor. I didn't offer her a seat or a drink. Instead, I stood by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. "Do you remember the last thing you said to me before you threw me out of the mansion?" I asked, my voice calm. She looked up at me, her brow furrowing. I don't. "Thanks for the $3 million inheritance," I quoted, turning to face her. "Now get out. My new boyfriend needs space." Her face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I was awful," she admitted. "I don't know why I said those things. I thought I was untouchable, that I didn't need anyone. But I was wrong." "Yes, you were," I said, my voice firm. She sobbed openly now, her body shaking with the weight of her emotions. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said between gasps. "But I'm begging you, Oliver. Please help me." I stared at her, the woman who had once taken so much from me, now standing in my living room, drenched and defeated. For a moment, I considered her plea. It would have been easy to give in, to let her back into my life out of some misplaced sense of compassion. but I had learned my lesson. You made your choice, Vanessa, I said, my tone cold but not cruel. You built your life on greed and deceit, and now you're paying the price. I'm not going to save you. Her sobs grew quieter, and she looked up at me with a mixture of despair and acceptance. I understand, she said softly. I walked to the door and opened it, motioning for her to leave. She hesitated, looking at me one last time. I'm sorry, she whispered. I know, I replied, but that doesn't change anything. She stepped out into the rain, her head bowed, and I closed the door behind her. For a moment, I stood there, staring at the closed door, the echoes of her voice still lingering in the air. I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only peace. Vanessa's return had been a test, a final opportunity to see how far I had come. And as I walked back to the balcony, watching the city lights glow through the rain, I realized that I had truly moved on. This was my life now, a life built on strength, dignity, and wisdom. And as Vanessa disappeared into the storm, I knew I was ready to embrace the future, free from the shadows of the past.